Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Coopersmith Career Consulting History and Systems of Psychology crash course. This is a little bit more of a technical course than we've seen in other psychology and other types of courses. So we're going to have to, look at things in a little bit more of a memorization type fashion, and we're not going to be able to do as much, calculating. You don't have to do as much calculating. In some sense, that's good news. On the other hand, there is a little bit more of memorization in this course. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to, give you a little bit of an explanation and kind of hopefully make the memorization a little bit easier for you. But ultimately, there is still going to be mostly memorization in this course as opposed to a course like research methods in psychology, which is more about concepts and okay, we're going to start with the roots of psychology. The roots of psychology, which of course is really the basis for this type of course, is okay, where did psychology come from and how has it developed? Can trace its roots back to the 5th century BC, 2,500 years ago. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, people like that. Of course, psychology has developed a tremendous amount in the interim. You've got some old ideas of psychology that have been discredited, some old ideas of psychology that have been debated, some old ideas of psychology that have stood the test of time. And this that's really what kind of this course is about, looking at where different ideas have come from. It's one thing to look at kind of a snapshot. Okay, in 2018, what has what's the modern trend and the modern thinking of this sort of thing. It's another thing to say, okay, what people have contributed, what ideas. That really is what this course is about. What are the people that have contributed their ideas? What are their ideas? How do their ideas work? And just, a lot of this information are things that have been discredited or things that are no longer in use in modern psychology thought, but we're going to kind of look over a little bit of the history. This second point, again, a lot of the things on these slides are going to be a little confusing. That's why I'm doing this to try to, explain it a little bit. Psychology can be viewed as emerging when philosophy and physiology merge. Now, physiology means the science of healing or studying or working on physical elements of the person. Things like medicine and being a doctor is all about physiology. Then there's philosophy, which is based on the idea, okay, what's the general feeling in terms of what nature is and what the world is and why the world exists, and things that are much more metaphysical, things that are not as easy to to crystallize or to clarify. And psychology is kind of a blend between that. How do we apply philosophy to the human behavior? How do we apply philosophy to the human mind? How do we apply ideas to the way humans behave and humans act? Modern psychology is based on 19th century thought. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is based on what they just thought in the 19th century, which is the 1800s, and that we don't have to worry about anything since. In fact, clearly many of the ideas from the 19th century have been discredited. But this is kind of like where all the the founding fathers, so to speak, of modern psychological thought existed. People like Viktor Frankl, people like Sigmund Freud, and many others that we're going to discuss during this course. Were lived many of them actually lived in Central Europe in the same basic geographical location, places like Vienna, and they kind of contributed a lot to the to the general ideas of psychology. And of course, the issues of the time have a tremendous influence on what the focus is of psychology at any given time. Certainly in today's day and age, the advent of the internet and social media has an enormous impact on psychology. In other words, something like how many likes you get on Instagram may be part of the self-actualization goal of how things are looked at in today's day and age, where obviously 10 years ago these sorts of things didn't really, or 20 years ago at least, these things didn't really exist. So you can't underestimate the influence of an era and the technology and the way in which people integrate in their society on psychological ideas. It's one thing for Sigmund Freud to, to make a determination of what drives the human ego or how the human ego drives human behavior, but how that happens and how that's developed really depends on the era, depends on the political views of the people, depends on the social views of the people, depends on the religious views of the people. All of these things are certainly very important. One example over here that's discussed in the text: during the World Wars, psychological testing, personnel selection in engineering, because personnel selection, okay, who's going to make the best soldiers? Who's going to make the best factory workers? In engineering, for building things, for, turning people into mechanisms by which effective war making can be done. Uh, the whole psychological world, or at least part of the psychological world, was engineered to try to make sure that each side has the best soldiers and the best producers and the best war making potential. The next thing I want to look at is the difference between looking at history and looking at science. Psychology in general is a science, maybe not quite as hard a science as calculus or physics, but certainly based on science. History is information, and history doesn't, for example, have a right answer. History is open and subject to interpretation, especially what you are learning from history and what to take away from certain historical data or historical lessons. This course is a little bit of a fusion between history and science, because we're looking at things through a historical lens. That's why it's called history and systems of psychology. And we are also looking at the systems of psychology, which is the mechanisms by which psychology is practiced and how history influenced that. So, the difference between history and science is the idea that when you're talking about historians, there's no way, first of all, to refine history. There's no way to make history, with a theory, you can change it. You can say, okay, it was incomplete, and now we're going to add a little bit of a nuance to it, and now it is complete. With history, you can't really do that. History, the facts are what they are, and unless you find new artifacts that indicate things didn't happen as you previously thought they did, you're pretty much stuck with whatever happened. Historical data cannot be reconstructed in a laboratory. Maybe the idea of whether their theories and whether their ideas were accurate, that can be reconstructed in a laboratory. But when John Stuart Mill lived, or what Sigmund Freud thought, is not something that you can reconstruct. It's something that you have to look at the data and just try to determine what happened. Some original info, of course, is lost. When it comes to a scientific experiment, you might have lost information in terms of how a particular scientific principle will be applied, but you can regain that information through the scientific method. In other courses, we discuss in much greater detail what the scientific method is. Essentially, it's the idea of developing a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis through experimentation, and trying to figure out a way to keep testing it until you are able to produce theories or rules of nature. When you're talking about history, there just may be information that's lost, and it's completely impossible unless you find more documents or unless you find more buried data to actually reproduce these things. If we don't know what a particular person said on March 8th, 1808, and all the records have been examined and it just doesn't exist, well, there's no way we're ever getting that piece of information unless we invent some sort of a mechanism by which to go back in time or to see these things. So we have to assume that some information is lost, and the distortion of data through translations. In today's day and age, you have video, and if you're not sure what happened, go look at the video. So maybe when people are talking about historical events that happened in the early 21st century, if we're sitting here in 2150, well, they might be able to go back in the videos and fill in the blanks that they might have, but there are no videos of things that happened in 1825, so we have to rely on the records, and the records may be influenced by bias, by ignorance, by pretty much anything. When we're talking about the historical aims or the historical military campaigns of the Roman Republic, for example, we've got to rely on a few historians. We've got to rely on Plutarch or Josephus or what's his name, Tacitus or whatever, whoever data we find, and they might not, they might have had their own axe to grind. Maybe they painted the Roman armies in a little bit more of a favorable light. History is influenced by that, and there's really nothing we can do. Whereas scientific theories can be tested against an objective standard. Do they work? If something is not reproducible, if something cannot be tested in a lab, then it's not really scientific. So that's another important difference between studying history and studying science. And that's also based on this other idea. Some data is best described as being distorted to promote a particular impression of a person. If so, whoever wrote the book on this individual wanted to criticize the individual or wanted to praise the individual, that could change the way the book is established. I've recently read this book on Robert Moses, who was a great builder in New York City, written by Robert Caro. And in some areas, you can tell he was trying to pump him up, and sometimes some areas you can tell he was trying to tear him down. He tried to be as neutral as possible, but certainly how people look at the life of Robert Moses forever and ever is going to be influenced dramatically by the authoritative work on him. And if you had somebody else write the book who was Robert Moses's grandson or best friend, his historical reputation would be a lot different than it is now. So those are also things that you have to definitely keep in mind whenever you're talking about history, whenever you're talking about looking at something through a historical lens. Okay, who has practiced psychology? These are things that are changing, of course, just like the rest of society, but it is important to remember, and certainly part of this course, how various minorities and women, who are not necessarily minorities, but certainly have had less of an opportunity to study and contribute to the field of psychology throughout history, have been treated. When we look about the contributions of John Stuart Mill and Viktor Frankl and Sigmund Freud, it's important to note that they were essentially all white men, and people who were not white men have historically had been at a disadvantage when it comes to studying and contributing toward these things. Here are some examples over here. In 1960, we had Sandra Scar was told by her officer interviewing her that most women don't finish the degrees, and the ones that do amount to nothing anyway. And then, of course, you have other examples, cases in which women have overcome and minorities have overcome the discrimination. But of course, it does remain a historical fact in this field and in many others that women and minorities have had a much more difficult time establishing themselves in the field and contributing themselves to the field. Not necessarily because they didn't have the talent or the expertise or the insight, but because there was prejudice and based on the idea that essentially white men were the only people that were considered capable of contributing to the field. That, of course, has changed dramatically. And I'm sure there's still some discrimination in some areas today in many contexts, but certainly there's a lot less description that there once was. Other victims of discrimination, as you see over here, were Jewish people who were also subject to discrimination from the major universities, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, which are three of the eight quote unquote Ivy League universities. Those were I don't know if those are necessarily the three most prestigious universities of the country, but they're certainly three of the most prestigious universities in the country. And Jewish people and people of other origins as well were certainly discriminated against as well. Those Jews that were admitted to college were very often separated and socially ostracized, kind of kept out of the halls of power, kept out of the the circles where the people that were going to be the real movers and shakers were allowed. But again, you had people who overcame that. In fact, just to give you an example, Sigmund Freud himself was Jewish, so was Viktor Frankl, as a matter of fact. Many eminent historical psychologists, especially from Europe, were Jewish. Of course, in the United States, at least until 50, 60, 70 years ago, was a little different, just based on the fact that they essentially weren't allowed into the major circles of power. African Americans have also, I'm sorry, okay, African Americans also faced an enormous amount of discrimination. Same basic idea. The These were historically black colleges like Howard University did start to establish psychology programs to try to allow African Americans to kind of get their foot in the door. But again, especially until recently, and maybe even in some circles today, people who are minorities certainly did face tremendous obstacles to contributing dramatically towards the profession. We next have a whole slide over here on the idea of a school of thought because you hear a lot about different schools of thought, the Freudian school of thought and various others. A school of thought is a mechanism of thinking. It doesn't necessarily have to be associated with a school, although many of them are. There's the school of thought of the Chicago mechanism for Chicago for economics, which is literally based on the production of people from the University of Chicago. Then there are schools of thought that have nothing to do with schools or universities. They're just based on the idea that a variety of people who may have had similar ethnic or similar geographical or similar other characteristics have tend to come down on a particular side. Thomas Kuhn, and by the way, Thomas Kuhn wasn't a psychologist. He was a physicist who passed away in just I think just a couple of decades ago. I don't think it was that long ago. But he wrote that when a scientist produces an accepted way of thinking, that is called a paradigm. And you hear that word a lot. I like to use that word a lot. A paradigm is a mechanism by which we do something or a way of thinking. Paradigm could be as small as, the way you study for a test is to open the book and read all the material and test yourself at the end of a chapter. And if enough people do this, and it becomes a way of thinking that this is the best way to do it, you can call it a paradigm. Paradigms are present in all types of sciences and pretty much every mechanism of life. For 300 years, there was the paradigm was with the Galilean Newtonian framework. For those of you who may not be so familiar with physics, that's based on the idea of how gravity and how astronomy works. The Newtonian model was for the most part, the same gravitational model as we think of today. The famous Newton and the apple falling on his head, the idea that there is gravity, and of course there still is gravity. And when Einstein came along, he kind of changed the paradigm of physics because he established that the gravitational model, the ideas of gravity, the way we think of gravity, and the rules of gravity that were established by Newton and similar great physicists only work when you're talking about areas of relatively low gravitational pull, like the surface of a planet. If you're in a black hole or you're on a inside a massive object like a star, the same rules that Newton applied and and that you saw you see with other people who explain gravitational models don't really work. They kind of break down. But that's an idea of a paradigm shift, of paradigm change. We were always looking at gravity as applying equally no matter where you are, and then Einstein came along and showed that no, time and space and all of these other things really kind of depend on where you are. When you have a really, really, really strong gravitational pull, the rules of physics just change totally. So again, for us and living in everyday life on the surface of the Earth, Newton is fine because there's not such a strong gravitational pull. It's just the Earth, which is a pretty big in our reference, but in astronomical terms, it's not really that big. But in things where you're looking at the inside of a black hole or you're looking at other artificially generated very, very high energy fields, you might not necessarily be able to apply the Newton rules of gravity. That's an example again of a paradigm shift. So when we talk about a paradigm shift of psychotherapy or psychology, it may be okay. We always thought that the way to treat this type of depression was with this drug and this therapy and this psychoanalysis or whatever it is, and this person came along and said no, we should do it under this, that, and the other thing. And as that gains currency, and as that gains, excuse me, I've changed the slide. As that gains popularity, then we have a different way of looking at things. That's the idea of this paradigm shift that you might hear that term. So I think it's important to understand, what that means. Because psychology remains divided, there's no prevailing school of thought. There's no way you're going to get everybody to agree on something. It's one thing when you're talking about mathematics. I think we can get all mathematicians to agree that 3 plus 3 equals 6, but we can't get all psychologists to agree that the best way to treat depression is with Prozac. Now, that's just obviously one very, very, very small issue, but one aspect of a very large issue, really. But there's no inherent reason why everybody would agree. For one reason that, like I mentioned before, psychology is a little bit of an inexact science. It's a science, but it's an inexact science. It may not be, at least to our current level of technology, a way to absolutely prove a correct answer in terms of the way and the reason why the human mind works in a certain way. So many contemporary psychologists criticize the entire field because of its fragmentation. Fragmentation interpretation means that today, although we've had a lot of scholarly work, there are still many, many different opinions. Some people will say that psychoanalysis is good. Some people will say that psychoanalysis is useless. Some people will say that psychoanalysis is good only when it comes to this kind of problem or that kind of problem, etc. That's the idea of the school of thought, and because of the nature of psychology, these change so dramatically as you move along. Who does influence modern psychology? Well, there are many different types of people that influence psychology. But one thing, and that says over here, and that's very important to realize, is that psychology has kind of distinguished itself dramatically from philosophy. As I mentioned before, philosophy may have had influence in the origins of psychology, but today psychology is still considered or looked at through the scientific method, not necessarily philosophy. A philosopher sits back and says, why is there a world? Why is there a sun? Why is there a stars? What are humans here for? These are all things that are not really covered by psychologists, because psychologists, they may look at a method and say, okay, how is this treated or how is that analyzed? And they may look to try to, and they look to try to test it through the scientific method. Does this thing work? Okay, let's look at an experiment. Let's publish a paper that says we studied this many people and we tried this treatment and this worked to this extent and that worked to that extent. So you have less philosophy and ideas and more rigorous testing, like you would a biology question. If you had a question, a medical question, doctors wouldn't sit there and say, well, this ought to work. Penicillin ought to work for a strep throat. No, they would test it. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. You move on. So that's more whereas in the 1800s, when there was less, they had the scientific method, but there was less of an ability to share data and to generate data. Maybe people like Freud might have looked at things more in terms of how things ought to work or how he felt that things should work or how, from a more philosophical perspective. Here we're looking at it much more from a scientific and scientific method discussion. In fact, psychology can be looked at as a sequence of failed paradigms in the idea that everything or most ideas that have been quote unquote settled among psychologists have later been questioned or later been disproven. And, in some sense, you can say that with all sciences, that as we move along, we keep seeing how everything we previously thought was wrong, or at least a lot of the things that we previously thought was wrong. But that's especially true in terms of psychology. As we refine things, less and less of what we previously knew stands the test of time, because that's just the nature of any field, especially the field of psychology, which to start with is really such an inexact science. The naturalistic development of theory is based on the idea that psychological theories can be derived from nature, derived from people, derived from experiences. That's one way of looking at things. And it's not an alternative. It's not, either naturalistic is 100% right or 100% wrong. It may be partially correct. It may only work in, with regard to certain types of psychological phenomena. And that's the idea that, okay, so that's the idea that if different people in different parts of the world in different environments will come up with the same idea, that's the idea that they really ought to come up with the same idea, because they're studying human beings, and human beings are, pretty much alike more than they are not alike throughout the world. So if an idea is true, different people will come to the same conclusion from different starting points, is the idea of the naturalistic development of theories regarding psychology. And scientific resolution occurs when the new theories displace the old ones, changes in paradigm like we already discussed. Okay, let's look at Unit 2, which we look at in terms of influences on psychology. The idea of artificial intelligence is non-human, really computers, or computer-like creatures, and their abilities to study or glean information from human conduct. This has always, captured the human imagination. Charles Babbage and his calculator that could also play chess and other games. When I was a kid, there was this idea that the computer could never become as good as a human being in terms of chess because the computer wouldn't be able to see that far in advance and wouldn't be able to come up with strategies. And then the middle to late 1990s came, and the best computers started walloping the best human beings. And today, the best human beings don't really have any kind of a chance against computers because computers simply have the raw power, the raw computing power to analyze hundreds of trillions of different or whatever the number is of different possible moves, and so the best humans can't really hold a candle to the best computers. When it comes to anything that can be solved through math or through different possibilities or through different calculations, the artificial intelligence will eventually overcome the human being. However, as Ada Lovelace over here, who was a self-educated mathematician, she posited that there's a difference between the way a human thinks and the way a machine thinks, that a machine can't create something new, it can only do what it's programmed to do. A machine can make 100 million calculations in a second, perhaps, but if there's something wrong with the programming, the machine can't adapt. The machine's got to listen to its own programming. Now, human imagination has run wild with this idea of artificial intelligence. It's all over media and science fiction and novels and things like that. I mean, just to give you a few basic examples, there was the famous 2001 A Space Odyssey, which was a movie that was directed by Stanley Kubrick, based on a book by Arthur C. Clarke. And in that movie, I don't want to go through the entire plot, but at one point, the machine or the spaceship, the spaceship running the machine, HAL, decides that it needs to lock out one of the humans on the basically there's a disagreement between the human who's running the ship and the machine that controls the ship and that is the ship really, or is aboard the ship. And the machine says, if we listen to the human, then the human's going to ruin the mission, and it's my job to to keep going to the mission. So I got to basically lock out the human and keep the human away from essentially trying to kill the human in order to not jeopardize the mission. Now it's kind of like this fear that one day the monsters are going to take over. There's a recent sci-fi series called Black Mirror that came out with a few episodes recently about the possibility of artificial intelligence just totally taking over human ideas and just displacing humans. The question is, what do they do need to be programmed? But if they are programmed, for example, to do something no matter what, and the human then changes his or her mind, the machine might not change his or her mind, and the machine might not be amenable to the human's instructions. There was even one a while ago there was I think a movie called AI, which based on the idea that we could replace children with machines who could behave and act and give love like regular children do and be loved like regular children do and be raised. There's all sorts of controversy and also some fear when it comes to artificial intelligence in terms of how much artificial intelligence can replace the human function, but there is this idea that artificial intelligence is limited by its programming, whereas the human has the unique mechanism by which the human can adapt and come up with a new idea, think totally outside the box, uh, something that even though that the person has never experienced it. Next, we're going to continue looking at the influences on psychology, and we've got three, I guess, I don't know if I'd call them theories, but more the ideas that modern psychology are based upon, and none of these are mutually exclusive. All of them can exist independently or together. And that is positivism, the doctrine that recognizes that only natural phenomena or facts are objectively observable, which is the idea that you can only know something is true if you can measure it. There are many ideas that we assume are true, that we live our lives in accordance with, that cannot be objectively proven. But when you're talking about things that have to do with bases upon which to start treating things or to start analyzing things, the positivism idea is that you can only start with an assumption is true if you can mathematically prove it. Other things you might believe in, but those are not necessarily bases upon which to act. Eyewitness testimony, I mean, that's really a legal example, but would not be proven from a positivism standpoint because it relies on someone's impression. It can actually be proven. The fact that person A killed person B, it can actually be proven. Maybe a videotape, perhaps, but if there's no videotape, just an eyewitness, you have to rely on that person's memory. You have to rely on that person's lack of bias. You have to rely on that person's ability to perceive, ability to interpret things properly. Now, the legal system cannot operate on positivism. The legal system has to rely on things like eyewitness testimony because unless there's a videotape or unless it happened in front of the judges, there's no way to really know for sure that something happened. But you have to look at it based on the preponderance of the evidence, based on beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal context. But positivism is really just based on the idea that you can't consider something completely proven until you can actually observe it or prove it. You can prove that a particular gravitational pull applies to a particular object because you can reproduce it. You can test it in the lab. You cannot test whether something happened in a lab. Then there's materialism, the fact the universe can be described in physical terms and explained by properties of matter and energy, based on the idea that's really the two key studies of science. The study of energy is physics, and the study of matter is chemistry. Those two twin areas of science. Of course, there's biology, but biology, in some sense, is really just based on the building blocks of chemistry and physics. So materialism is the idea is that everything can be described in terms of matter, which means things, and energy, which means the ability to do work, which means the ability to cause motion. Everything is based on what there is and how it's moving, how fast it's moving, how much energy it's moving with. Even cells, even biological phenomena, even heartbeats, things like that can all be measured in what is there and what is its motion. The heart is muscle tissue and its motion is contracting in order to pump the blood throughout the body. That's the idea of materialism, where everything can be broken down ultimately to matter and energy. Empiricism is the idea that all knowledge is derived from sensory experience. Of course, we all got five senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. We all rely on those things in terms of experiences, and really everything can be explained by that. This is how it looks, this is how it sounds, this is how it tastes, this is how it smells, this is how it feels. Everything that we experience can be broken down into one of those five things or some combination of those things. All of these things are, the quote unquote philosophical basis for psychology, because really that's ultimately upon which everything can be based. If you're going to determine how somebody behaves in a certain way, okay, how do they react to this sense? How is the reaction described? In what way can it be proven? All of these things are the underlying building blocks upon which all science, including psychology, is really based. The last two bullet points over here go through just how their roles, positivism and materialism, the idea of only establishing something that's true if you can sense it, and the idea of explaining everything in terms of what the physical object is, its matter, and how it moves, its energy, allows things to become observable. Without these two ideas, there's no real way to establish a framework upon which things can be observed. But if you can say things can be observed based on how they move and based on what they are and based on whether you can perceive it, you now have a framework upon which to gather evidence and to gather observations. And then you have the idea of empiricism, which is how the body senses and the mind perceives, the association between those two things. Obviously, our brains interpret whatever information we get through our five senses. None of these are earth shattering. None of these are concepts that you probably didn't already think about. You didn't all these concepts are things that you already knew pretty much. But still, if you look at it in this way, and these three ideas establish a mechanism by which something can be proven. If you didn't start with the idea that something can only be proven if you're able to observe it or reproduce it, and something really entails what it is and how it moves, and that it needs to be able to be sensed in order to exist, then you wouldn't have proper frameworks to, if you didn't have those ideas, you wouldn't have proper frameworks in which to experience things. Again, these are all things that people probably inherently sense anyway, even though they might not necessarily be able to define it. Now let's bridge the gap a little bit between this idea of positivism, materialism, and empiricism, which are really all ideas that are based on the natural world, how everything springs from natural behavior and the rules of chemistry and the rules of physics. And let's kind of apply that to psychology. Obviously, it doesn't apply completely, it doesn't apply as much as it does when you're talking about mathematics or when you're talking about physics. But we have a couple of famous psychologists through history, James Mill and his son, John Stuart Mill. James Mill applied the mechanism to the mind to prove essentially that the mind simply reacts to stimuli. Stimuli could be pain, stimuli could be sadness, could be emotion, could be fear, could be danger, and that human behavior is simply a reaction to whatever the stimuli of your environment are. Whatever happens to your environment, that's what your human behavior is reacting to. Now, his son, John Stuart Mill, expanded on this a little bit and said, well, that's a little bit more simplistic than, than the reality. The reality is the mind is a little bit more than just a reaction. It's a little more than, like one of those lights that goes automatically on when a person passes in front of it. The mind works on a little bit of a higher level than that. What the mind does, it's complex and it takes different ideas and combines them. He said that's his idea is really kind of the human mind is able to take different ideas, take disparate ideas, and apply them in different combinations. Reactions of fear, reactions of things that are more. Yeah, sorry. So Stuart Mill's idea was that we take many different stimuli and combine them. I guess that's kind of like a unique human way of doing things. We can't take into account things that we don't know. We can't take into account ideas that that we've never experienced or that we don't know what to do with. But we can take things and combine a whole bunch of different stimuli into one overall package. He also he also said that the argument that it was possible to make a scientific study of the mind, it's harder to do than making a scientific study of the heart, which can be done physically. It can be done in a petri dish. You can't really make a study of a petri dish of human thought, and it doesn't at least at this point in our technology, we can't really measure the impulses that pass for thought. But still, we can study human behavior like we do other sciences and then you have ethology, which is the study of human behavior from a biological perspective, and the idea in terms of what are we built for, what are our needs, what are our, both from a physical standpoint of the individual and from a societal standpoint. We also have the need to be social. We're social animals. We like to make sure that we live in a society that functions. And one way to look at psychology is to way to look at, okay, what's the best way to run our society in a way that fits with our biological and sociological and needs. So that's the idea. They notice the similarity between the words ethology and ethics. I haven't seen anybody that's actually made this connection, but it seems to me that the idea of ethics is what's the most appropriate way to function in society in order to develop a society, and that might be similar to the idea of ethology of studying, the best mechanism by which the human can react in order to make things overall appropriate for the person. Okay, now we move into the idea of the mechanistic image of human nature. And this is really kind of a continuation of the themes that we looked at earlier of the idea of human nature being informed by biological factors, by the senses. The five senses that we discussed earlier, and the idea of studying physical and physiological processes of the human, things necessary to eat, breathe, sleep, think, and do all the other life processes in a human being, and how they are related to psychology, how they're related to mental perception. How does our psychology manifest itself in a way that allows us to more easily carry out our other life processes? How does our psychology help us eat? How does our psychology help us find food and make money and establish a shelter for ourselves? And do things that allow us to carry out our other life processes. British empiricists, remember the empiricism which we discussed a little bit earlier, the idea that all knowledge is derived from sensory experiences. So empiricists argued that sensation, which is the sensing process, is ultimately the only source of knowledge. Again, that doesn't mean, like John Stuart Mill said, that you can't take senses and combine them and make a much more complex thing. Just take something as simple as eating food. They say that one of the reasons why airline food doesn't quote unquote taste as good is because it might taste the same as it does on the ground, but the sense of smell is decreased at that level, maybe because there's less air pressure for whatever reason. You don't smell food as much at 35,000 feet as you do at sea level, and even in a pressurized cabin. And because of that, the same food is going to taste better on the ground than it does in the air. It might taste the same, but the overall experience, the smell in this case, is decreased. When you eat something, it's the sight of the food. How does it look? The presentation certainly matters. The smell obviously matters. The taste obviously matters. But also, the touch matters. How does it feel in your mouth? Is it crunchy? Something that's if you have a good fillet of fish and that's breaded and it tastes really crunchy, and that might taste better to you, even though something else that's less crunchy that might have the same taste and the same smell and the same everything, but the feel of it being crunchy might also change the perception of it. Even something as simple as eating is kind of a combination of how the senses apply to it. And these methods and frameworks coalesced, which means gathered together, to form early psychology, and that's kind of the basis of the way we look at things. Let's take a look at some other, to end off Unit 2, and take a look at some other influences on the history of psychology. First, we have Descartes. Descartes with a silent ES at the end, because I guess he was French, I suppose. And his notion was, he was a mathematician, actually. His idea was that psychology can be treated like other sciences in that it can be broken down into formulas, axioms. Axioms are things that are inherently true because they're obvious. Postulates, you may recognize that term from algebra or geometry, which is the idea of something that is apparent, and therefore we can take it as a fact when it comes to mathematical proofs and mathematical formulas. Descartes was also the person that came up with this idea of rationalism. Rationalism is kind of the idea of doubting everything that you've heard and then trying to rebuild it and then trying to reestablish it through the scientific method. That's also based on the idea that you can't assume anything is true. You have to apply mathematical principles. And mathematical principles means in order for something to be considered a mathematical rule or mathematical postulate, you have to be able to prove it. And it has to work 100% of the time. You have to be able to test it and it has to always be able to work. Now, other sciences can't be held to that standard where it works 100% of the time. Even, Zithromax doesn't cure strep throat 100% of the time. You take it because it cures strep throat 90% of the time, and that's better than nothing. It's better than something else which cures strep throat, less than that. But so you can apply mathematical principles to the same extent as you do others, but still, this idea of rationalism, I think he was the one that coined the original phrase cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. Something can only be established if you can think it through, so to speak. That's the Descartes idea, really very based on math, based on underlying fundamental knowledge. You have John Locke. John Locke was the same person who established a lot of social theory and social philosophy. He was the purveyor of natural rights theory, saying that every person was born with certain natural rights. His idea, he actually wrote that everybody is born with the right to life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson later kind of plagiarized that phrase and turned it into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. The United States Constitution actually guarantees life, liberty, or due process of law before the government takes away a person's life, liberty, or property. That's directly based on Locke's writing. So the point is that Locke was a very famous social philosopher. He also wrote a lot about the social contract, about people giving the government the authority to govern them in exchange for protection, in exchange for order, with the exception that the government cannot actually take away somebody's rights, and if they do, they're doing so wrongfully and illegally. But Locke's idea was that everything's got two qualities, a primary quality, two sets of qualities, two types of qualities. Primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are things that are independent, things that doesn't matter it doesn't matter who you are. These things always stay the same. And then there are things that depend on the senses of the observer. Something like how many fingers I have, that is independent. I've got 5 fingers on my right hand. I've got another 5 fingers on my left hand. Then there's the question, okay, how many fingers can you see that I have? Maybe because there's something blocking part of my hand, you can only see 4. That's kind of a secondary quality. I have over here an example. I found this in a scholarly article where Locke gave an example, which I thought was a very interesting example over here. Take a grain of wheat, divide it into 2 parts. Each part still is solid. It has extension, which means it has length, it has figure, it has shape, it has mobility. Divide it again, it still remains the same qualities. The point is, at some point, though, when you break down, they become insensible. They become to the point where a person cannot measure it because it's too small. For example, sometimes you can't see something except under a microscope. Well, that is it still has the same inherent behaviors, but now it is no longer sensible to human machines or human sensory activities. Then finally, you have G. Stanley Hall, and G. Stanley Hall was the father of this idealized behavior idea. The idealized behavior idea is that people, when they're born, when they start to develop, they develop in a way that follows their order, follows just their nature. People follow their nature when they're born. When children act, I mean, you can see this on a day-to-day basis. Children follow their nature unless they're told not to, and unless they're disciplined or whatever it is. They're gonna run wild, and they're gonna take what they want, and they're not gonna follow concepts like personal property and rights and fairness and whatnot until they're taught. Eventually, they'll figure it out. But Hall's idea was that they're gonna behave regarding their nature, and at some point, he wrote really what he wrote more of. If you Google G. Stanley Hall and you look about most of the works, most of his works deal with this storm or most of the analysis of him deal with this storm and stress idea, and the idea that people, when they're children, really when they get to be teenagers, they start to break out of this natural order of behavior, and they start to kind of settle down into an adult outlook. But while they do, things become very there's a tremendous upheaval and a lot of confusion as teenagers, as adolescents, people starting to become adults start to look at things differently as they always did, and start they this transition from just a purely natural behavior to looking at the world as an adult is something that causes a lot of stress in many aspects of being an adolescent. In Unit 3, we continue with the discussion of the founding of psychology. This idea of structuralism is where we get into in this unit. And we're going to start with two people, Wilhelm Wundt and Gustav Fechner, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Fechner was actually the earlier one. He was Wundt was the one that popularized a lot of these things. Fechner was, I guess, the first one that started this idea of systematic experimentation before these people lived, which was the early to mid 19th century, early to mid 1800s. That's why I mentioned way back at the beginning that the 1800s were kind of the beginning of modern psychology. There wasn't really an application of the scientific method to these ideas. And remember, the scientific method was really just kind of getting into its own in that era also. The people who really were the original purveyors of the scientific method, people like Charles Darwin and his ilk, were also lived in the 1800s. Although the scientific method itself is a little bit older than that. But anyway, so these were the people that really started applying the scientific method and being able to use, not necessarily in the same kind of laboratory that we think about when we talk about testing petri dishes and testing medicines, but the idea of testing and using experimentation on psychological illnesses and treatments and how they work. Today's day and age, when they try psychological treatments, they use the same basic scientific methods as they do when you're testing testing out the efficacy of a pill. Look at the treatment, look at 1,000 people, 500 of them with this treatment and 500 of them with a different treatment. Try to keep everything else the same and see which one works better and see which way in which that one works better. So these two people, especially Wundt, kind of they're his significance. Wundt, other aside from the significance of his idea, which we're going to discuss in the next slide, Wundt was also kind of popularized this idea of doing scientific experimentation on psychology, and that's one of his legacies. He promoted the idea of scientific community and that experimental psychology is a unique discipline distinct from philosophy. Today, philosophy and psychology hardly have anything to do with each other. But in those days, as we discussed before, psychology and philosophy were considered essentially the same thing. Philosophy is how things ought to work and the reasons for things, and psychology is how people thought about things. Well, today it's looked at much, much more of a science than a philosophy. In any case, so those were some of Wundt and his predecessor Fechner's uh, legacies. But let's now take a look at his legacy in terms of his ideas. So, first of all, he emphasized this idea of the will to organize the contents of the mind, this voluntarism, which is the idea of trying to make sure that you find a voluntary reason in all human behavior. The idea that human behavior is not something that is predetermined. It's really kind of the idea of free will. The idea that it's not like a computer, which is programmed and has everything that it's going to do established by its creator, and it's really just literally a machine. Human beings are based on voluntary action, not based on predetermined action. Titchener further developed the idea there's structuralism, which focuses on relationships of contrast between elements, that the idea that structure is more important than function, that looks at behavior as part of a relationship in a larger system, doesn't look at every action in a vacuum. That's kind of a really kind of an expounding of Wundt's work. But then you have this idea when you move to Stumpf and you move this idea of Gestalt psychology. Now, Gestalt psychology is something that we're going to discuss in much greater detail a little bit later on. But I wanted to kind of focus on that because it's interesting in that Gestalt psychology seems to have been both an outgrowth of the idea of Wundt's ideas and also a little bit of a paradigm shift, so to speak, in Wundt's ideas. Here's an interesting description that I found about it. Well, Wundt was interested in breaking down psychological matters into their smallest possible parts, looking at each behavior, saying, there's voluntarism, in other words, this particular action is done in response to this particular decision. Then there's the Gestalt psychologist, which takes that really a giant leap further by saying that looking at the totality of the mind, the guiding principle is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, there are many people, Kant and Goethe, a lot of these are German philosophers that influence this, but remember, these are all, right, I think these philosophers are all people that lived before this era. Goethe and Kant and some of these other people lived, I believe, like in the 1700s, and certainly most of their work was done before the mid 1800s when many of these psychological ideas were developed. But still, they were influenced by the philosophy, which looks at things on a much more big picture level. I thought this was a very interesting little analogy. It was influenced by Wertheimer's, who was one of the founders of this school of thought. His observations at a train station, he purchased a toy stroboscope, which today that means something a little bit different, but what essentially it seems that with this displayed pictured in rapid sequence to mimic the appearance of movement or appearing movement, that is similar to animation. Like cartoons, today it's done by computers, of course, but in the old days, what cartoons were you had a whole bunch of pictures and they would just flip from one picture to the next, and there'd be one picture where the person in the middle, and then the next picture the person would be a step to the left, and then the next picture the person would be two steps to the left, and the next picture the person would be three steps to the left, and when you showed all four pictures, bang, 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 if you did it quickly enough, it looked like the person was walking, even though it was just separate flat pictures, and that's essentially was animation. And his idea he established is that every individual element of our behavior is part of a greater idea or part of a greater series of movements. In other words, we perceive movements when there's not necessarily movement. Movies, of course, are one example, and that's the idea that we look at the whole of the behavior, even though, maybe one particular aspect of our behavior, maybe making a self sacrifice, maybe doing a favor to somebody, might not be able to be explained by one individual stimulus and one individual voluntary thought, but by a whole series of voluntary thoughts. It takes this idea of voluntarism and it combines it with some of the things that we discussed earlier of taking many different stimuli and combining it, the John Stuart Mill idea, where we're not confined like computers are to looking at things from a unilateral lens. We kind of associate how much weight to give each factor in making a decision.
For a long time, questions of human motivation and behavior were considered a part of philosophy. Philosophers asked many of the questions that underlie psychological study today, particularly the debate over whether behavior and personality are shaped more by nature or nurture goes all the way back to the Greeks. But philosophers didn't go about answering these questions in systematic or scientific ways. Their theories couldn't be proved right or wrong because they were based only on casual observation. Psychology really got going as a discipline when two men decided to take the principles of scientific research and apply them to the study of human behavior. Wilhelm Wundt was a German scientist who founded a laboratory in Leipzig that took a structuralist approach to psychology. William James was an American who founded a laboratory at Harvard that took a functionalist approach. We'll take a closer look at both men and their approaches in order to more thoroughly understand psychology's foundation as a science. Wundt's lab, founded in 1879, was the first of its kind. His structuralist approach sought to identify the building blocks, or the structure, of psychological experience. Other sciences had been broken down in this way before. Chemistry had its periodic table of elements, and physics had its fundamental laws. Wundt sought to do the same for psychology, establishing a series of fundamental relations or structures that could be used to explain all behavior. Wundt and colleagues, like student Edward Titchener, used a method called introspection to learn what was going through people's heads as they completed various tasks. Wundt was especially interested in how people processed sensory stimuli, and he was the first to draw a distinction between sensation, or a stimulus's effect on one of our senses, and perception, or our brain's interpretation of the stimulus. He discovered this by realizing that when he asked people to listen to a sound and respond as soon as they heard it, they were much faster when all they had to say was whether they heard it, rather than if they had to say what sound they heard. The processing and categorizing of sound took longer than the hearing of it, indicating that perception is a process that is separate but related to sensation. This is a fundamental concept for psychology that Wundt was able to discover through subjects' introspection. The problem with introspection, though, as you've maybe probably guessed, is that people's descriptions of their own feelings and reactions are often wrong. Let's say a psychologist like Wundt were trying to figure out the softest sound a person could hear. He'd play a sound and then ask if you could hear it, relying on your introspection to determine how sharp your hearing is. But if you expected to hear a sound, you might think that you heard one even if you didn't. And Wundt would conclude that humans can hear much softer sounds than they actually can. We're inaccurate about all sorts of things. Even our memories are full of inaccuracies and exaggerations. So while introspection was valuable as an attempt to apply a scientific method to studies of the mind, some of its results suffered from our inability to accurately report our thoughts and feelings. Over at Harvard, William James was working out a functionalist approach to solve some of these problems with structuralism. He thought that Wundt's method of trying to understand complex mental processes by subject self-reports was ultimately futile, akin to seizing a spinning top to catch its motion or trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. The method of measuring would always change what psychologists were trying to measure. James, heavily influenced by Darwin's theory of natural selection, preferred instead to question why we behave the way we do. He wanted to understand behavior in terms of its function in our lives, how it helps us or hurts us, and why certain behaviors are more common than others. As Darwin answered questions about physical features, like which advantages humans gained by evolving to stand upright, James answered questions about behavioral features, like why humans experience jealousy. James's functionalism gave rise to the modern field of evolutionary psychology. This branch looks at various behavioral and personality traits in terms of how they improve fitness. Evolutionary fitness isn't what happens when you go to the gym and bulk up. It refers to your likelihood of passing on your genetic material to the next generation. Your likelihood of having lots of children, basically. A man who acts jealously is more likely to worry about protecting his wife from the advances of other men, and therefore has a better chance of ensuring that all of the children she has are actually his. His jealousy improves his fitness because preventing his wife from having other men's children allows him to have more with her. So for a quick review, Wilhelm Wundt and William James were some of the first psychologists to study the mind scientifically. Wundt founded the first psychology lab to carry out his structuralist experiments. Structuralism relied mainly on introspection, which William James objected to because it was too subjective. James's functionalism sought instead to explain behavior in evolutionary terms, to understand why certain behaviors were helpful to survival and evolutionary fitness, and others were not.
The rest of the unit kind of looks at Wundt and Titchener's contributions, their theories, and why they don't, maybe not are not quite as useful as they might have been once. Okay, so first of all, Wundt's original approach that really broke things down into individual behaviors and individual stimuli, the voluntarism idea that everything is dictated by a particular stimulus and by a particular thing that you see, and that's why you react to something. So that didn't have that much practical application because, as a practical matter, as the Gestalt psychology, which is the reason kind of why it overshadowed Wundt's idea, is that people look at things from the whole perspective rather than from the individual perspective. I mean, think about it. If somebody says, "I don't want to eat that," now, that could be for many different reasons. They could not eating it because they've got dietary restrictions that the thing violates. They could not want to eat it because it's not hungry, because they're not hungry. They could not want to eat it because they're full. They could not want to eat that thing because it has too many calories, or because it has too much cholesterol, or because they're going to have dinner in an hour from now, or whatever it is. And yes, it's true that it something could be based on a particular stimulus, and you have this voluntary idea based on a voluntary decision. But on the other hand, there could be so many different factors that are relevant. You see a cookie, and can I eat that? Well, maybe I, if I were a little more hungry, I would eat it. But the fact that I'm not that hungry, and the fact that I'm don't want to ruin my appetite for supper that's going to be in an hour and a half, and the fact that it has too many calories, there could be so many different factors and so many different things. Let's say supper were in 2 hours from now instead of in an hour. What if I had already lost weight on my diet, so I wasn't that concerned anymore? That might militate in favor of eating the cookie. What if was worried that my blood sugar level was too low? That might militate in favor. So when you make a decision, you don't make a decision based on one stimulus. You make a decision based maybe on a whole bunch of different factors. You might not articulate it. These things may or may not go through your mind, and even if they do, you might not even notice it because they go so fast, and you make it based on so many different things. But your decision is really based on a combination of so many different factors. So that's really the main idea in terms of why the Wundt approach has been replaced by this approach of everything being on a much more macro, much more deeper level. Titchener established the idea of introspection. There's an interesting little example over here that I'm going to try to describe because when you look at it, it probably doesn't make that much sense to you. The idea that if you look at a vase on the counter and you say, I see a vase on the counter, that would be a stimulus, error, and introspection. The idea that Titchener established is that when a person is analyzing something, what they should analyze is strictly based on whatever the stimulus is strictly based on whatever they're observing, whatever the observation is, not based on what they've been told the name of the object is. It's something that we all do, so but when you're on a, we know what a vase is. But when you look at a vase, let me back up for a second. When you look at a vase, you can say that's a vase because I've seen 1,000 vases in the past. I know what a vase looks like. Or you can say, well, that is a contraption that looks like it's made from glass and it's got about 8 ounces of water in it and it's shaped so that it should be able to hold water and will also be able to hold flowers. And you can break it down. And the idea is if you're looking to test something from a scientific level, you shouldn't give the whole definition of it because that is a conclusion. The fact that it's a vase, if you think about it, is a conclusion. You look at a person and say, that person looks sick. The person doesn't look sick. The person exhibits behavior or looks that makes you conclude based on your past experience that the person's sick. The person's eyes are downcast, the person's flush, the person is sagging, the person is frowning. There are many different things that you're observing. So when you're talking about getting if you're collecting scientific data, you shouldn't say that person looks sick. What you should say is that that person looks a little bit paler than normal. That person looks eyes downcast. That person looks, etc. And then you can draw your conclusion. That was his basic idea. That's his idea of introspection. The idea that you should look at things. People look at things based on what they observe, and if they draw conclusions and therefore don't analyze what they're observing. Nothing wrong with doing this on a day-to-day basis. We all do it all the time. But from a scientific perspective, that's a quote-unquote stimulus error. It's an error of introspection because you're looking at data that you see and you're drawing a conclusion rather than just drawing the raw data. Now, even though his ideas were overshadowed, that doesn't mean that Titchener didn't actually contribute anything. This idea of introspection, this idea of looking carefully at the environment, looking carefully uh, at your at what really your environment. I can't really think of a better word from that. It leads to use of good scientific controls. If you describe everything just simply by the observation, it's this hot and it's this angle and it's this big. These are all things that are much more helpful in looking in doing scientific research than drawing a conclusion. Some of the criticism of it is its artificiality, sterility. Doesn't sterility means like it's sterile. It doesn't really have any uh, life to it, so to speak. And of course, the fact that it just doesn't have that much of an application to real life problems. That's it doesn't really matter. I guess it doesn't really matter that much whether you call it a vase or call it a piece of glass that has it's 32 centimeter circumference, etc. Okay, and finally in this chapter, we're going to look at independent experiences versus dependent experiences. Independent experiences don't have to be observed, whereas a dependent experience, it only matters to the extent that it is dependent on an observer. Independent experiences are data. Cold, hard, unmalleable data. The water is 86 degrees. That is an independent experience. It doesn't have to be observed to be 86 degrees. It is 86 degrees. That is an objective fact. Nobody being scientifically accurate and scientifically honest can tell you that it's not 86 degrees if it is 86 degrees. Dependent experience, on the other hand, is something that requires somebody else to experience it in order for it to matter. Something is warm. If I say it's warm, that's not an objective fact. Warm is relative. Today, and it's late February, and it's in the New York area, and it's about, I don't know, 45 degrees outside. 40 degrees. Tomorrow it's going to be 50 degrees outside, according to, well, that's a better example. Tomorrow it's going to be 50 degrees in the afternoon. It's going to be warm, right? Well, that's fine because it's February in the New York area and it doesn't usually get to 50 degrees in February in the New York area, so it's warm. But on the other hand, if I were in Bermuda and it were 50 degrees, it would be freezing. If I were in Miami, it would be 50 degrees, it would be freezing. If it were in New York and it were July, 50 degrees would be considered freezing. Not literally freezing, as in, colder than the freezing point of water or anything like that, but cool. Well, is tomorrow going to be a warm day or is it going to be a cool day? Well, it's going to be a warm day because it's February. If it were July, it would be a cool day. That's the idea of a dependent experience. Now, psychology, unlike physics and chemistry, which is essentially totally independent, something they're based on motion and has nothing to do with whether there's an observer or not, doesn't matter. The old one, if the tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Then, of course, the answer is yes, it does make a sound. There may not be anyone around to hear it, but so what? It makes sound waves. Psychology doesn't work like that. Psychology has to be relative. The whole idea of reactions to things and how something works on the human mind means that by definition it has to be a dependent experience. There's no such thing as objectively sad or objectively happy or objectively angry. It only depends on how people react. So that's an important idea, that psychology is really all based on dependent experiences, and the whole idea of independent experience doesn't have as much of an application in psychology as it does to the other hard sciences. And finally, for Unit 3, we have the work of Hermann Ebbinghaus, who lived in the late 1800s, and his ideas of learning and memory. He established what is sometimes known as the learning curve. The learning curve has many different applications. It has applications to psychology, it has applications to economics, it has applications to education, obviously. Learning curve is the idea of how quickly people are able to pick things up, and that depends on many different things. It depends on experiences, things that you have experience with. You're much more likely to be able to pick things up in that area faster than if it were a brand new subject for you. One of the things that he did was he developed long lists of just nonsensical syllables and recorded the success over a number of trials of different people that were trying to learn these things, how long it took them to learn it, the number of repetitions it took. And what this showed is, okay, how much experience in an area do you need in order to be able to memorize something? I think we all understand that if somebody tells you a story, maybe hard to memorize the words of the story, but it's a lot easier to memorize the words of a paragraph, let's say, than it is to memorize a whole bunch of random syllables, because your experience doesn't tell you what's going to come next. If I tell you to memorize the syllables igloo ma, well, you probably can because it's only three, but let's say it were 50. You wouldn't be able to remember 50 consecutive syllables. It would be virtually impossible because you have no experience in terms of what's going to come next, and so you have to really memorize it from scratch. Whereas a paragraph, like the preamble to the Constitution of the United States or some sort of a rule, you would be able to memorize more quickly, and that's part of his idea of the learning curve.
Hermann Ebbinghaus was a German psychologist who lived from 1850 to 1909. He is best known for his experiments on memory, which he conducted during 2-year-long periods. The first series of experiments was conducted between 1878 and 1879. The second set was conducted between 1883 and 1884. Ebbinghaus was the first person to develop an experimental approach to the study of memory, but what makes him even more interesting is the way that he conducted his experiments. When we think of experiments today, we imagine a lab where a few research assistants test tens of participants. However, Ebbinghaus didn't have a lab, or research assistants, or participants. He conducted all of his experiments in his home by himself, and he used himself as his only subject. Even though he had only one participant, Ebbinghaus made discoveries that are still applicable today. That is because his experiments were conducted very carefully. In this video, I'm going to tell you about Ebbinghaus's experiments. Ebbinghaus was interested in the effect of repetition on memory, so he first needed something that he could repeat. He decided to use nonsense syllables. By nonsense I mean that the syllable has no meaning. To give an example, a syllable like cat has a meaning, so Ebbinghaus would not have used it, whereas a syllable like cag has no meaning, so it could have been included. Ebbinghaus designed a set of 2,600 cards for his experiments. On each card, he printed a unique nonsense syllable. To create a series of syllables for a memory task, Ebbinghaus would draw cards at random from the deck. He didn't place these cards back into the deck until all of the syllables had been used once. Ebbinghaus also had a set of rules that remained constant for all of his experiments. First, when learning a series of syllables, Ebbinghaus did not allow himself to break it into chunks, and then recombine the chunks once he had learned them. The entire series had to be learned at once. Second, Ebbinghaus read the cards, and later recited the syllables, at a constant rate of 150 per minute. To measure the time, Ebbinghaus first used a metronome, but he later switched to a watch, since its ticking was less distracting. Third, Ebbinghaus read the words without any inflection. Because he knew it would be hard to talk in a monotone voice for a long period of time, Ebbinghaus allowed himself to place a slight inflection on either every third or every fourth syllable in a series, depending on the experiment. Fourth, after reading a series, he would take a break of 15 seconds to tabulate the results for that series. After his 15-second break, Ebbinghaus moved on to the next series of syllables. Fifth, Ebbinghaus tried to memorize the series as fast as possible. To do this, he dedicated himself to learning the series, avoiding any distractions. Sixth, Ebbinghaus avoided using any mnemonics in learning the syllables. He didn't attempt to create any associations between the syllables and real words or objects. He did this because he wanted to test the effect of repetition on memory, not some other process. Finally, seventh, Ebbinghaus tried to control his life during the period of the experiments, so that all outside factors would be as constant as possible. He especially tried to keep his routine immediately before each test as similar as possible. If he felt that his routine had been disrupted, he would stop doing the tests until he could resume his normal life. He also tried to limit himself to one experiment per day, although sometimes he was forced to conduct more than one. Ebbinghaus dedicated over 2 years of his life to memory experiments. Each day he would spend 4 hours memorizing nonsense syllables and testing himself. For some tests, he learned two 36-syllable series back to back. To determine the effect of time on memory, he waited up to a month before testing himself on some series. Ebbinghaus published his results in 1885 in a book titled Memory, A Contribution to Experimental Psychology. If you'd like to read Ebbinghaus's book, it's available online at psychclassics.yorku.ca/ebbinghaus/index.htm. If you'd like to learn more about Ebbinghaus's life and his other research, here are some sites to check out. Thanks for watching.
Okay, let's start with Unit 4 over here, and this is about functionalism and applied psychology. Some of these are about really going to continue some of the issues that we already discussed before. Functionalism in general is simply the stress or practical application of something. Stressing something for its practical application, stressing what the practical applications of a theory are, all of those things is the idea of functionalism. And as we discussed before, the schools of Wilhelm Wundt and Titchener were kind of discarded almost because of their lack of functionalism, because there was no real way to apply these things. But some of Titchener's work did have the idea of setting up this idea of functionalism, and the applied psychology is the idea of taking concepts and applying them to practical terms. And here we have the interesting point that Titchener may have inadvertently formalized the school when he wrote an article articulating the differences between structuralism and functionalism. His idea was structuralism. Remember structuralism, the idea that every reaction, every action is based on response to a type of stimulus. And then he kind of contrasted that with functionalism, and then functionalism kind of took over as being the more vital and more important and more applied school of thought. And that brings us to the, I guess, kind of building on Titchener work by John Dewey. John Dewey lived a little bit later than some of the other people we've been discussing. He was born in 1859. His seminal work on the applied psychology was published, I believe, in 1914. But the point is, his idea was really moving much towards this functionalism aspect. He attacked psychological molecularism, elementalism, reductionism, all of these things. Molecularism breaking things down to the molecular level, elementism breaking things down to the elemental level, which is again the forces of nature, reductionism trying to reduce everything to a particular stimulus, trying to reduce everything to a particular point. His was much more based on the idea of applying and functionalism and stressing the practical application of everything. And his, just as an aside, he also was famous for being a proponent of democracy, being a proponent of people governing themselves. His whole school of thought, sometimes referred to as functional psychology, really went against the traditional, stimulus response or reflex arc theory. All the things you may have noticed, the things that we've been discussing for the past half hour, are all based on this idea of reflexes and stimulus response. Dewey's was much more, I guess, optimistic about the human condition. Things aren't just based on, aren't done on base instinct. They're done on with a higher thought and more application. I think that kind of very well segues toward his ideas of championing democracy, of people in terms of governing themselves are capable of governing themselves because they don't just rely on their base instinct. They also use higher levels of thought in making decisions. One of his arguments over here that a child reaching for and being burned by a flame can't be reduced to elements because, first of all, then it might only apply to that particular flame. It wouldn't, the child, for example, wouldn't necessarily learn about other hot things, whereas we know in real life, when a child gets burned by something hot, it's not just that particular same exact looking and feeling and surrounding hot item that the child learns to stay away from. The child learns to stay away from hot things in general. Maybe not all hot types of hot things, but let's say, for example, fires. You get burned by a fire once, next time you're going to stay away from fire, and it's not just that color fire. The color fire that burnt you might have been orangish, but you're still going to, based on the idea that even a flame that's a little bit more bluish could burn you also. He wanted to look at things at a much more general level. That there's no single form of functionalism because everybody is so multifaceted. It's not just, you can't just apply the same rules to everybody. You have to look at the various circumstances. And that the idea, again, he rejected structuralism because it reduced consciousness to basic elements and didn't look at the bigger picture. Next, we move to Darwinism, kind of as a precursor to the psychological idea of social Darwinism that I want to discuss. Now, Darwinism, of course, is based on Charles Darwin, the famous biologist who established that organisms, species, even people, develop over time. They develop by this process of natural selection. That is, let's say, for example, uh, birds that fly the fastest are the ones that get the food, and so therefore the ones that get the food are the ones that live long enough to reproduce, and therefore the next generation is more likely to be able to fly fastest and be strongest and best at hunting food because those are the good genes they get from their parents who were able to survive. Now, obviously, there's also the connotation of how humans originally evolved, and there's the segue between religion and Darwinism. I'm not going to get into that. That's really a totally separate issue. The whole idea of Darwinism was the idea of this survival of the fittest, of the idea that when it comes to individuals, there's survival of the fittest, and also when it comes to, social paradigms and social ideas, the ones that have the most success are the ones that endure. The ones that don't have success are the ones that die out. The ones that people don't buy into or people don't have success with aren't propagated. That could apply to species, but it also could apply to ideas. Where if you have a philosophy and the philosophy works really well for you, you're much more likely to instill it in your children, or try to get your friends to, or try to convince your friends that these are really good ideas. So that was the idea of how Darwinism kind of applies to psychology. It says over here the zeitgeist was right to accept Darwin's theory. You might not have heard of that term before. Zeitgeist is kind of like the way in which people or society reacts to something, or the spirit of society. Sometimes certain types of entertainment or certain types of ideas find more acceptance in some generations than others, even though they're the same ideas and people are fundamentally pretty much the same from one generation to the next, because the zeitgeist changes. The zeitgeist is just what people feel in a particular era. It could vary not only from generation to generation, but also from country to country and from city to city and from community to community, from industry to industry. People in the entertainment industry might have a different attitude than people who are physicists or doctors or whatever it is. So that's based on the idea that why Darwinism gained acceptance in the middle 1800s when this idea of the fact that species of animals evolve from generation to generation didn't really get much acceptance beforehand. So, because other scientists had previously developed theories that laid the groundwork for Darwin's theory, but the idea that the Industrial Revolution, now the Industrial Revolution started arguably either in the late 1700s or really got going in the early 1800s, which was a change from a more agrarian society where people pretty much grew their own food and, well, I guess they sold their food too, but society was based on mostly farming. And then it grew into a society where the production of society moved over more to a factory based model. Obviously, you still had to have farming, but production, large scale production of things that eventually led to everything we have today was born kind of in the Industrial Revolution. Now, some people say we're going through a new kind of Industrial Revolution where the technology is and the information technology is increasing so much that we're moving into really that new era. And then you have the ideas that in the 1830s, primates like monkeys were exhibited in zoos as they weren't before, and people saw the similarities. Okay, but we don't necessarily have to worry about that. But then we have the idea of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism applies the idea of Darwinism, survival of the fittest, to social ideas, to ideas in society. Nations of the world are in competition for survival, like competition among species for survival. Nations that do the best become the most. It's not that nations die necessarily, especially in today's day and age. The old days, I guess, countries that were weak got swallowed up and taken over by their neighbors. Today, it doesn't happen so much, but certainly political power waxes and wanes depending on how well a country does. Countries that do very well from an economic and a cultural perspective end up having much more influence on the world stage. Then there's the idea that government shouldn't try to restrict the activities of business. That's the idea of capitalism. Capitalism is also a form of Darwinism. The ideas of capitalism were even established before Darwin. Authors like Adam Smith, people like that lived a long time ago, but they had this idea that what you do is you let companies compete, and then the best companies, the ones that provide the best service and have the best customer satisfaction and are able to do things the best, are the ones that are going to survive on the market. That's an idea of social Darwinism also, and that government shouldn't impede the rich by heavy taxes because the rich are need for economic. Again, that's really more political, but the idea that is the Darwinism idea. The idea is that if you stifle competition by making the people that do the best pay 80% or 90% of their money to the government, then people are not going to have the incentive to do well. Now, that's of course a very superficial way of looking at it. There are other ways of looking at it that it's important to make sure that everybody has what they need in order to survive and in order to have a certain level of human dignity. And that's all fine and good. That's politics. But the idea of social Darwinism is certainly an idea that's had a very strong impact on economic philosophy and political philosophy as well. Okay, that brings us to the development of applied psychology, which of course was really a natural outgrowth of both social Darwinism and the development by Dewey on the Titchener basis, so to speak, that we just discussed. Okay, so in terms of development of applied psychology, there was this idea that it kind of was slowed down because of the decrease in funding and ability of people to study these things in great academic depth. There are not enough academic positions to employ all the people with a PhD in psychology, based on the idea that when it comes to college professors, there are only a limited number of jobs. And there was also we're talking about in the early 20th century, approximately that time, there was an emerging problem of a decrease in public school enrollment, which led to a little bit of a crisis in the educated or undereducated public, so to speak. And then you also had the idea that people would, rather than going into academia and becoming people who founded and furthered the schools of thought and the paradigms in psychology, people could make more money doing it for industry. People could make more money doing it for as for individual companies, maybe for applying it to corporate psychology projects or for individuals. If you're a psychologist, maybe you can make a couple $100 an hour. It's a lot. You make a lot more money making $200 an hour to do psychoanalysis on people than you do being a college professor, where you may only make 50 or $60,000 a year. Okay, so that moves to the fact that their economic condition, the fact that it was so much more lucrative to work in the private sphere, that led to a shift in business and industry. Now, we're going to come back to the law of suggestibility in a minute, but the law of suggestibility, in short, means that people are susceptible to what they see in the media. The media is obviously a lot bigger than it was then. When in the 1800s, when psychology was first developing, there wasn't that much of a media. There were newspapers, obviously, but today we're bombarded constantly with media, and what we're told, that's how advertising works. Advertising works because you see it on TV, or you see it on the internet, or you see it on social media, or you see it in newspapers, whatever. You see something that says, this is a good product, so you think this is a good product. We all assume that Coke and Pepsi are the standard in soda, and that Honda and some other companies are the standard in cars, or from a luxury car perspective, Lexus and Acura and BMW. Why do we think that? We've never actually tried these things. None, at least I haven't. I've never driven an Acura probably in my life. I've never driven a Lexus in my life. I've never driven a lot of these cars, but I assume that they're the best just because I keep hearing about it. I keep hearing about it on commercials. I keep hearing about it in the media. That's based on the law of suggestibility, where people are susceptible to suggestion, and people subconsciously, even if not consciously, are influenced by the suggestions that they hear. Okay. Now I want to move on to something that was developed by Woolley and Hollingsworth. Hollingworth was Lita Stetter Hollingsworth, and Woolley was Helen Thompson Woolley. They both developed their philosophies. They were both born in the late 1800s, lived until the middle of the 20th century, did most of their work in the early 1900s, and they did some studies on gender variability. In many areas, including psychology and some other areas, these tend to be male dominated. Not all areas, but when it comes to things like physics, when it comes to things like mathematics, when it comes to things like that, generally speaking, the Nobel Prize winners, the Fields Medal recipients, things like that, very often tend to be male dominated. And Woolley and Hollingsworth, obviously both women, uh, did a study on this. And the hypothesis, the guess about why this is true, why you have this gender difference, is the quote unquote variability hypothesis. Variability hypothesis is the idea that men are much less likely to be close to the average, whereas women are more likely to be concentrated around the average. You might have, for example, when you're talking about famous mathematicians or psychologists or whatever it is, you might have more men that are well above the average and more men that are well below the average. So overall, there might be the same. You might have the exact same average overall between the genders, but you have more men that are way above and more men that are way below. So the people who are way above are the people who are naturally going to dominate the very, very top of the industry. That's the idea of the variability hypothesis, and it's been applied to many other areas, things like mathematics, where the idea where the average girl is just as strong as the average boy, but the weakest boy is much weaker than the weakest girl, and the strongest boy is much stronger than the strongest girl. That's the idea behind the variability hypothesis. So then that would be the reason, that would be an explanation perhaps of why men tend to dominate the upper echelons of some of these fields. Now Woolley and Hollingworth they tested this hypothesis, and they did not come up with evidence that it exists. Their idea was that there really is not much of a variability hypothesis, variability at all. That overall the men and women should be overall equally, but because of the fact that the reason for the difference, the reason why men generally would tend to dominate the area, is because of essentially prejudice, the fact that women were kept out of the upper echelons of these areas. That was their idea, that there would be some difference. As you see on the bottom bullet point over here, they found there was little difference between men and women in physical acuity or mental intelligence, that they were essentially even. The only slight difference that existed was because of the fact that there was limited education of women and differential in child rearing practices. Now, this is not in today's day and age, this is back in 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, women received a little bit of less education. And also, when children were brought up, especially in those days, boys were brought up more to learn things and to achieve more, and women were brought up, I guess, more to learn to be homemakers and learn to, do things like cooking and whatnot. That was, one possibility. And the idea was that the reason why women were underrepresented is essentially based on prejudice and based on the expectations of society that women wouldn't really be focused that much on those particular jobs. Okay, and that kind of also moves into this idea of the suggestibility, which I mentioned a little while ago. Idea was developed by Walter Scott, and he pointed out what we all know essentially from advertising. If you have a technique to tell consumers use Kleenex tissues and not the generic brand, that's based on the idea of suggestibility. When you go to the store and you look at the shelf and you see the Kleenex costs $5 and the generic brand costs $3, you still might buy the Kleenex because you've been conditioned to think that Kleenex for some reason is better, which it might not actually be better. We see this a lot when we talk about drugs, generic over-the-counter drugs, things like NyQuil and cough medicine, cough drops, things like that. There may be no. If you look at the active ingredients between Nyquil and the CVS brand of cough and cold medicine, it's the exact same active ingredients. I mean, it's the exact same ingredients in general. It's pretty much the exact same thing, just in two different bottles. One of them says Nyquil on it, one of them says Target brand cold medicine, and it's the exact same thing. But the Nyquil costs $9.99 and the Target brand costs $6.99, and still people buy the Nyquil because they've been conditioned to assume that the generic is not as good and Nyquil is better. This applies to many different types of products. Of course, there are products where there are legitimate differences, but there are also products where the differences are really just kind of a figment of our imagination. This also could lead to the idea of the gender difference, where we're conditioned to assume that women are not going to be the preeminent psychologists of the era, and so that's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where people perhaps pay less attention to academic work that women do, even if they don't mean to do it. It could just almost be like an involuntary thing. Okay, another area was the study of living people as they adapt to their environment, and that became became the central idea of functionalism. Remember, functionalism was the idea that we discussed a little while ago in the case in the Ebbinghaus study, and in general, the more modern, more American idea of functionalism, more so than looking everything as being the product of a natural stimulus. And finally, for this chapter, we have the idea of the mental age. The mental age is simply the ability expressed at that age as compared to when an average person would reach that ability. Now, the ability includes reasoning, mathematical calculations, and various other types of mental processes. So, if a 2-year-old can perform the same tasks as an average 3-year-old, then the 2-year-old's mental age is 3. Obviously, the person's physical age is still 2, but his or her mental age is 3. Then we've got the IQ. IQ stands for intelligence quotient, and it is derived from standardized tests which were designed to measure humans' intelligence. Now, this is not something that is infallible. There are some people that will tell you that IQ tests are worthless. There are some people who tell you that IQ tests only are what they are because they were written by psychologists, whereas people, if they were written by architects, they would be totally different. They would measure how well you can draw things, which IQ tests don't really measure. But IQ tests certainly were developed and at least have, the ability to make apples to apples comparisons between different people, in at least their ability to do the tasks that are established by the IQ tests. The hope is the theory is that they're pretty well correlated with intelligence. A person with who gets something a higher mark on an IQ test, the hope is, the theory is, the reason why they're there is because then you can infer that that person is more intelligent. You can also figure out a person's mental age by comparing that person to an IQ, simply by adjusting for that person's age. If the child has a mental age of 3, so the person now has 1.5 times the mental age of a normal 2-year-old. Let's say if a person is 20, well, 20 by that point it's already kind of flattens out. But let's say you're taking a 10-year-old has a mental age of 12, so that's 20% more than the person's physical age, and then the person's IQ would be 120. That's the way IQ tests are built. They're for children, they're based on age. For adults, they're not really, it's kind of like a straight up comparison, but although IQ tests very often do get adjusted for age as people get older. As people get older, they're not necessarily they get less smart, but their mental acuity, their ability to do things quickly, their ability to think of things quickly actually slows down. People have the sharpest, quickest ability to do things from a mental perspective at maybe age 25, 30, 35, somewhere around there. A person gets to be 50, 60, person has more experience, person may be able to make better decisions based on life experience, but certainly the person's ability mind slows down a little bit, and so IQ can adjust for that as well. So IQ adjusts for age, and IQ measures intelligence by seeing how many mental tasks people can do.
Let's talk about behaviorism.
We begin in late 19th century Russia, where scientist Ivan Pavlov lived with his dogs. Whenever Pavlov would bring the dogs their food, they would salivate. One day, he walked into the room without food and was shocked to see that the dogs were still drooling in anticipation. What Pavlov had accidentally discovered was the concept of classical conditioning. He didn't have to do anything to make those dogs drool when they saw food, but Pavlov wondered if he did something to make the dogs think they were getting food, could he make them drool whenever he wanted to? And that's just what he did. Pavlov first identified the stimulus, the thing that caused the dog's response or behavior. In this case, the stimulus was the food because it caused the dogs to salivate. Then he paired the stimulus with a separate incident, the sound of a bell. Every time Pavlov brought the dogs food, he rang a bell. Once the dogs got used to the sound of the bell at feeding time, Pavlov tried ringing the bell without giving the dogs any food. And voila, the dogs started drooling anyway. Pavlov had successfully trained the dogs to react to the new stimulus, the ringing of the bell, the same way that they reacted to food. Classical conditioning is a learning process that inspired behaviorism. By taking an unconditioned stimulus, the food that naturally caused the dogs to salivate, and combining it with something entirely neutral, the bell, he was able to remove the first stimulus and make something that was formerly neutral elicit the conditioned response. But we'll talk about that later.
John B. Watson, an American psychologist, was intrigued by Pavlov's studies. He, along with many other behavioralists in the 20th century, believed that psychology should be a science, that is, based on facts and observable measurements. He believed that human development could only be based on what one could see. Watson was famous for saying he could take any child and turn him into anyone he wanted, just by changing the child's environment. A musician, a lawyer, a businessman, a doctor, even a thief or a beggar. John Watson was most famous for his work with an 11-month-old infant named Little Albert. Although his methods would be highly unethical today, Watson made great strides in the field of behavioralism and classical conditioning. For example, Watson conditioned Little Albert to have a fear of rats, using a very similar method to the one used by Pavlov. Every time Little Albert was presented with a white rat, Watson made loud noises and startled the child and made him cry. After a while, all Watson had to do was bring the rat near Little Albert and the baby would scream and cry. In this experiment, the loud noises were considered the unconditioned stimulus. Little Albert didn't need to learn to be afraid of loud noises, just like the dogs in Pavlov's experiment didn't need to be taught to drool at the sight of food. These things provoke certain responses naturally. Therefore, Little Albert crying serves as the unconditioned response. Crying or screaming is a baby's natural response to loud noises. Likewise, drooling is a natural response for dogs that smell good food. Once Little Albert began to associate the neutral rat with the negative, loud noise, the rat became the conditioned stimulus. That is, the previously neutral object that now elicits a response. In Pavlov's experiment, this was the bell that eventually made the dogs drool. And that makes Little Albert's fear of the rats the conditioned response. Even though he wasn't afraid of rats at first, he eventually learned by associating rats with loud noises that upset him.
B.F. Skinner, an American scientist born in 1904, took classical conditioning just one step further. Skinner is often called the father of operant conditioning, and he was most famous for conducting experiments with animals in his Skinner box. Like Watson, Skinner believed that psychology should be studied through a more objective lens, and that required hard evidence, observation, and experimentation. Operant conditioning is similar to classical conditioning, but by no means are the two the same. You see, operant conditioning involves changing one's behavior by use of reinforcement or punishment, which is given after a desired response. The behaviors that change in operant conditioning are voluntary. The behaviors operate on the environment to produce an outcome. It focuses on motivation, which is when someone or something has a strong reason to do something. Classical conditioning changes only the timing of the voluntary response.
Unit 5 is entitled Behaviorism, the idea of how and why behavior is formed and reinforced and encouraged to repeat or not repeat. Behaviorism is the theory that human and animal behavior can be explained in terms of conditioning, not necessarily just in terms of feelings and things like that, and it refers to Watson over here, John B. Watson, who we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail a little bit later on. But essentially, the idea of behaviorism is that emotions are tied to internal physiological changes, and physiological means you're feeling better, you're feeling worse, you're getting in better shape or in worse shape, whatever it is. These things are the things that drive emotions and not necessarily the things that drive behavior, but the behavior is driven by conditioning. And we've got two different types of conditioning that we want to discuss. We've got operant conditioning and respondent or classical conditioning. Respondent and classical conditioning are the same thing. We could also call it reflexive conditioning. Either way, so let's take a look first at operant conditioning. Operant conditioning was explained by B.F. Skinner, the famous psychologist who was, let's see, when was he born over here? He was born in 1904 and just passed away in 1990, just about, I guess, about 30 years ago, give or take. And what he said in terms of operant conditioning is that operant behavior requires the organism that is active in his or her environment. This idea of operant conditioning is more analogous to the reward and punishment aspect of conditioning. If a behavior is rewarded, then the behavior is more likely to continue because the organism, whether it be a person, learns that this is a behavior that will help. Whereas if a behavior is punished, then it will be discouraged for future reference. The idea here, the strength of an operant behavior increases when it's followed by a reinforcer. That could be a positive reinforcer or a negative reinforcer. From Wikipedia, a little diagram of operant conditioning that shows how positive and negative reinforcement applied. Punishment decreases behavior, which could be something like where you remove something good or add something bad, or it could be reinforcement, which increases behavior, which is a reward essentially. It could be positive, or of course negative reinforcement, which causes the person to either or organism to avoid the problem, avoid the noxious stimulus, or remove the noxious stimulus. The idea, again, we're all talking about reward and punishment. If something is followed by good behavior, if you give the monkey, if they jump on the chair, you give them a banana. If they jump on the floor, you give them an electric shock. That's a classic example of behaviorism, and all organisms can learn from that, as we all know. That's operant conditioning. Then you've got reflexive conditioning, where you're not necessarily using their thought process. With reward and punishment, you're using a thought process. You raise children to the idea that if they behave well, they get a reward. If they don't, they get a punishment. What you're really trying to do is you're trying to make them think and say, okay, well, I should do this because if I do this, I'm going to get a reward. And if I don't do this, I'm going to get a punishment. So the idea is that you're using their thought process. Classical conditioning, on the other hand, is much more indirect. Classical conditioning, you're trying to make it so that the person automatically does something because the person has it's almost like baked into the person's psyche or the person's condition. That's classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is the process of modifications in which an innate, which means inherent or automatic or quick reflexive response to a potential stimulus becomes expressed in response to a previously neutral stimulus. You pair a stimulus with a with something that is potent that teaches them or reinforces behavior to stimulate a result. The classic example here is the Pavlov. This is Ivan Pavlov, the Russian psychologist who was born in 1849, passed away in 1936. But he did studies in the classical conditioning, and what he did essentially was he took the dog. This is the famous Pavlovian response. He took a dog, and every time the doorbell rang, he gave the dog food. And I don't remember exactly what the process was, but it was something to that effect. And after a while, when the doorbell rang, the dog started producing saliva. Now, producing saliva obviously has nothing to do with the doorbell ringing in a vacuum. However, because of the fact that every time the doorbell rang, the dog got food, the dog then started to associate, not even consciously. Saliva is not produced consciously. You don't produce saliva intentionally. You do it automatically. You do it reflexively. But the dog got conditioned to associate the doorbell with food. That's the classic example of a Pavlovian response. A Pavlovian response means you don't think about it necessarily, but your body automatically reacts because your body associates one thing with something else. This is another example of pretty much same example. Play the trumpet and follow that with food to the horse's mouth. Repeat this several times, making sure to reinforce with food. Eventually, when the trumpet was played, the horse will salivate. That's the exact same thing, essentially. Conversely, if every time the doorbell rings, you hit the monkey, or then after a while, you do this every time, then every time the doorbell rings, the monkey's gonna start shaking and quivering and get scared because that's just natural. It has nothing to do with the doorbell per se, but the monkey is trained, conditioned to associate something happening. Again, it could be anything. It could be a human, it could be a child, for example. Whenever it rains, the parents stay home all day. Well, actually, that's probably so because the parents don't leave the house. So the child then associates the rain with the parent being there, which is not a direct result, but the child is conditioned to assume that. An example is the Little Albert study. This was conducted by the psychologist John B. Watson, again, who was I mentioned a little while ago. He was born in 1878 and passed away in the mid 20th century. He believed that children react to loud noises with fear because of an unconditioned response. And so he conducted an experiment in which he took babies, including the quote-unquote little Albert, well, an actual little Albert, and he used experimentation to give them fears that they wouldn't otherwise have had. For example, he took little Albert and he basically had a little rabbit, and he had the rabbit walk up to little Albert and play with him, and he was fine. He didn't mind the rabbit. He liked the rabbit, and they played a little bit. But then every time he touched the rabbit, they took a hammer and banged like the table. They didn't bang him, but banged the table behind him, and it made a very loud and unpleasant noise. And he did this every single time little Albert touched the rabbit. And before long, he hated the rabbit. Before long, every time the rabbit came near him, he started jumping away and started crying. And you're talking about an infant over here, not like a 5-year-old. You can go on YouTube and you can see the study. He would look definitely less than a year old. So then, of course, you have questions about the moral and ethical considerations of the study. They actually used real live children who may have been perhaps scarred for life. No effort was made to remove Albert's fears of the rabbit, so possibly for the rest of his life, Albert now fears rabbits. We don't really know. I guess Albert is probably either an old man or dead by now, but the point is that they were able to instill fear in him and to show how this classical conditioning works.
Give me a baby, and I can make any kind of man. These are the words of John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism. According to this worldview, the behavior of organisms, including human beings, is predictable and therefore controllable. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University, Watson experimented on several babies ranging in age from 3 months to a year. The experiments were remarkable in their simplicity. He would present a candle to infants to see if they were afraid of fire. He would introduce animals to their environment to see if the children were afraid of them naturally, or only after a traumatic experience. He would make a hissing noise and observe the results. Watson learned that newborn babies had no fear of the dark. He also learned, however, that such fear could be conditioned. And so it was with rabbits. This baby, known as Little Albert, initially found delight in touching a rabbit. Yet, as Watson began to clang a steel rod and claw a hammer behind the child's head whenever he touched the creature, the reaction became not one of delight, but terror. Soon, the mere sight of the rabbit would elicit fear, even when no noise was provided, a fear that also extended to objects and textures of a similar type. From his experiments, Watson reached a radical conclusion which would come to define political and social engineering in the 20th century. The driving force in society, he claimed, is not love, but fear.
Then we have this idea of path analysis. This was established by psychologist Clark Hull, again another person that was born in the late 1800s and lived until the middle 20th century. He's not as important for what he actually did, but to the idea of bringing quantitative study and quantitative analysis and data to the field of psychology, looking at numbers, percentages, what is statistical significance. That's really the study of the research methods in psychology course that we offer, and he was kind of like the unofficial grandfather of research methods, based on the idea that he looked into this idea of applying statistical methods and research methods to psychology. And of course, behaviorism is all about reinforcement. So the next issue to discuss regarding reinforcement is, different types of reinforcement schedules. Reinforcement schedule is simply something that is predictable. It's periodic. A weekly or monthly paycheck, like a salary, is a periodic reinforcement. You do your job, you don't get fired over the course of the 2 weeks, and at the end of the 2 weeks, you get a paycheck. And then, of course, there is fixed ratio reinforcement schedule, which means you get something benefit after you've done it a specific number of times, or after you've done it enough. That's like kind of working on a commission basis. Now, of course, we have various things that are relevant aside from our work schedule, that are relevant to various organisms. Things like you eat and you're not hungry anymore. You eat too much and you get a stomach ache. These are things that are fixed ratio in reinforcement, whereas fixed interval essentially is that after a given period of time you get some sort of a reinforcement, but they're just different types of reinforcement. There's not that much really substantial distinction between them. A couple of other concepts: learning by association and learning by connection, or learning by connectionism. Association is that there's a connection between mental states, concepts, or entities which result to proximity in time or space. Association, very often it's a flaw, or very often it's flawed reasoning. Association is when two things are near each other, and so you assume they're together. The classic idea: if you see a bunch of people walking in the street together, right next to each other, so you assume that they know each other, or you assume that they're part of the same group. They might not necessarily know each other. You might find out they just happen to be walking at the same speed, at the same time, in the same place. They might not have anything to do with each other, but if you see five people walking side by side, usually your first reaction is, oh, well, they probably know each other. They probably have some sort of a connection to each other. And that looks at ideas where people associate consequences or attributes to a temporal or spatial similarity. Things that are next to that. The example I gave before was where people are next to each other, but if things happen closely in time, people tend to associate them as well. Three things happen in a row, you get a headache and your arm hurts, so you tend to associate it all to the same cause if they happen right at the same time, even though they might absolutely have nothing to do with each other. Then you have a similar idea. Again, these are not mutually exclusive. These are all ideas that could coexist with each other, called connectionism. And this is championed by Edward Thorndike, and this is based on the idea of where you can connect an activity with a reward. This focuses on the behaviors rather than just the ideas. Now, it's kind of similar to the Pavlovian reaction, but here you're learning a behavior, not a reflex. The example here, the experiment that he did is he put a cat or a dog or whatever it is in a cage, and then whenever the dog would look at a certain component of the cage, or like a little portal that was built into it, or a little hole that was built into it, whenever he would stick his nose in there, he would get a little treat. And so it wouldn't be a reflex, where the Pavlovian reaction, where the dog would think that it's going to be hurt when something happens. Instead, it would just learn to do that. It would learn to put its head in that little cage over and over again, and it would learn to it would associate the benefit, the sticking the head there, with the benefit, with the reward. This is applied very often to learning behaviors where it's almost like you give a kid a small reward. This is the application, the strongest application to this is in learning theory for children especially. You give the child a small reward it stimulates their greater learning. You want a child to read a 1,000-page book. You say, "Well, I'm going to give you a prize if you read a 1,000-page book." The kid is not going to be able to associate the reward with finishing the entire 1,000-page book. So you say, "Listen, I give you a reward, a small reward, a tiny reward if you read one page." Then a child reads a page, gets a reward, starts to associate reading the book with getting the reward. Then I'll give you another reward if you read 10 pages, even if it's going to be a very small reward. You establish the positive reinforcement where the child now not only knows that they're after the full 1,000 pages where they're going to get the big reward, but the child now behaviorally associates the activity with the positive reinforcement result. And that's the idea. The child connects the behavior with the positive result. And finally, for this chapter, we have the concepts, I guess the opposing concepts of locus of control and self-efficacy. Locus of control is the extent to which people believe that they can control the events that affect them. Do people think that they can control their environments, or do they just kind of give up and assume that there's nothing that they can do to help themselves? Locus of control says, I make things happen, or this is it's that's a broad locus of control. A broad locus of control is I can make things happen. Of course, you want to have a broad locus of control. You want to be able to believe that you have a power to affect things around you, and people obviously do have that kind of power. On the other hand, if you take it too far, then you become a control freak. There's then there the people who think that they have no control over their environment have less of an incentive to behave and make good decisions because they figure they don't have control over things anyway. Self-efficacy refers to a person's belief in his or her capacity to execute behaviors necessary to produce performance attainments. In other words, this is the belief in a person's ability. They're similar concepts. Locus of control is, okay, what affects my environment? Do I affect my environment? Do external factors affect my environment? Or how am I going to look at the environment as a whole? And self-efficacy is, okay, to what extent do I have the ability to affect performances? Both of these are measured on scales, measured from high to low. People that, for example, self-efficacy could be measured in belief in self-confidence, belief in one's own ability. Those with low self-efficacy have fear of risk, fear of failure. They see themselves as being unable to complete what they need to do, complete what they need to perform and do what they need to do. Locus of control, on the other hand, again, it's a similar concept, but it's a measure of how much do I think that I can control. High self-efficacy means I'm confident that I can do what I need to do. I can be the best that I can be. I can study hard. I can know all the material. I can work 10 hours a day. I can do what I need to do. Low self-efficacy means I can't do this. I'm no good. I'm bad. Basically it's self-confidence. Locus of control is, what can I affect? External locus of control, which is really low locus of control, means I'm saying everything else affects the world. I don't really affect it very much. More internal, which is higher, says essentially I have the ability. What I do controls a lot of my environment. Okay, and the last thing in the chapter is animal psychology. This is Darwin, who's the same person who developed the theories of evolution and how animals develop, also looked at psychology of animal behavior, and basically the idea is what he would send originally is that animal and human behavior is not really that much different from a psychological perspective. It's really just a kind of a question of evolutionary principles. People are on a higher evolutionary plane and therefore have developed more of a nuanced ability to to control their environment and to control their own thoughts, and that was basically his approach. All right.
When we think about learning, we often picture students in a classroom or lecture hall, books open on their desk, listening intently to a teacher or professor in the front of the room. But in psychology, learning means something else. To psychologists, learning is a long-term change in behavior that's based on experience. Two of the main types of learning are called classical conditioning and operant or instrumental conditioning. Let's talk about classical conditioning first. In the 1890s, a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov did some really famous experiments on dogs. He showed dogs some food and rang a bell at the same time. After a while, the dogs would associate the bell with the food. They would learn that when they heard the bell, they would get fed. Eventually, just ringing the bell made the dogs salivate. They learned to expect food at the sound of a bell. You see, under normal conditions, the sight and smell of food causes a dog to salivate. We call the food an unconditioned stimulus, and we call salivation an unconditioned response. Nobody trains a dog to salivate over some steak. However, when we pair an unconditioned stimulus like food with something that was previously neutral, like the sound of a bell, that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. And so classical conditioning was discovered. We see how this works with animals, but how does it work with humans? In exactly the same way. Let's say that one day you go to the doctor to get a shot. She says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit," and then gives you the most painful shot you've ever had. A few weeks later, you go to the dentist for a checkup. He starts to put a mirror in your mouth to examine your teeth, and he says, "Don't worry, this won't hurt a bit." Even though you know the mirror won't hurt, you jump out of the chair and run screaming from the room. When you went to get a shot, the words, "this won't hurt a bit," became a conditioned stimulus when they were paired with the pain of the shot, the unconditioned stimulus, which was followed by your conditioned response of getting the heck out of there. Classical conditioning in action. Operant conditioning explains how consequences lead to changes in voluntary behavior. So how does operant conditioning work? There are two main components in operant conditioning, reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcers make it more likely that you'll do something again, while punishers make it less likely. Reinforcement and punishment can be positive or negative, but this doesn't mean good and bad. Positive means the addition of a stimulus, like getting dessert after you finish your veggies, and negative means the removal of a stimulus, like getting a night of no homework because you did well on an exam. Let's look at an example of operant conditioning. After eating dinner with your family, you clear the table and wash the dishes. When you're done, your mom gives you a big hug and says, "Thank you for helping me." In this situation, your mom's response is positive reinforcement if it makes you more likely to repeat the operant response, which is to clear the table and wash the dishes. Operant conditioning is everywhere in our daily lives. There aren't many things we do that haven't been influenced at some point by operant conditioning. We even see operant conditioning in some extraordinary situations. One group of scientists showed the power of operant conditioning by teaching pigeons to be art connoisseurs. Using food as a positive reinforcer, scientists have taught pigeons to select paintings by Monet over those by Picasso. When showed works of other artists, scientists observed stimulus generalization as the pigeons chose the Impressionists over the Cubists. Maybe next they'll condition the pigeons to paint their own masterpieces.
What's up guys, I'm Andrew Daughters, and today I will be conducting Ivan Pavlov's experiment on classical conditioning. So today, I'm going to be conditioning my older brother James, and hopefully by the end of the experiment, he will flinch in response to an alert sound on my cell phone. In classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response. Then a neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. Then the neutral stimulus alone causes a response. Initially, I will use an alert sound from my phone as a neutral stimulus to get an unconditioned response. Then for the next few trials, I will use this unconditioned stimulus of the ball hitting my brother to get an unconditioned response. Next in the experiment, I will attempt to make the neutral stimulus of the alert sound from my phone to get the exact same reaction as the paper ball being thrown at my brother through classical conditioning. After each alert sound, I will throw one paper ball at my brother. Let's have a look. You want attention? You trying to get attention? Dude, I'm trying to get this done by midnight. I have like 20 minutes. Dude. Stop. Did you see that? It actually worked. The conditioned stimulus of the alert from my phone received the correct conditioned response of my brother flinching. Thanks, Ivan Pavlov.
Unit 6 is entitled Gestalt Psychology. Now, remember, we discussed this a little earlier that Gestalt psychology is really more about the idea that the whole is greater than the parts. In other words, when you look at an entire picture, you don't look at them as everything individually, as each action, if a person takes a whole series of actions over the course of a long period of time, you look at the whole as like a pattern of behavior. In a way, Gestalt is actually from the German word that means to put together, or to form, or to shape, an entire thing being shaped. This slide is really kind of a list of some of the people that have just affected of Gestalt psychology. You don't necessarily have to remember their contributions necessarily, but we should still go through. There's Franz Bintano. He was a German philosopher. He was a German psychologist as well. His actual main contribution was something called intentionality, which is essentially about the relationship between the acts of people or the thoughts of people and the physical world. So you can see how that kind of segues with this idea of the big picture being the thing that you look at when you deal with psychology. There's Ernst Mach. He was also a Central European, really a physicist. He was actually a scientist. His contribution to psychology was actually about optical illusions, the idea of the exaggerated effectiveness or the exaggerated um, contrast. Let me show you a picture over here of what I mean. This is from the Wikipedia page over here. You see three things. You see three layers over here, slightly different shades of gray. As soon as they hit each other, the contrast becomes very stark. If you pause, I don't know if you can actually pause this thing, but if you pause it when it's further out, you can certainly pause the video. Now they don't look that different, but as soon as they come together, bang, they become very contrast with each other. Again, it's part of the Gestalt idea, based on the idea that you're looking at the big picture, and the human mind allows you to distinguish between things in the big picture because the human mind sees the whole big picture. Then there's Christian von Ehrenfels. He extended this idea to musical notes, explaining that how the big picture allows you to distinguish between musical notes in a song that differ slightly from each other. And then you have William James. William James was actually an American psychologist, unlike the rest of these people who were from Central Europe. And he again contributed with the idea that people see objects as wholes, not individual components or individual bundles of it. May seem pretty obvious, but of course he did a lot of study and established a lot of details in this area. Also part of the same concept of seeing, hopefully you're seeing a theme over here in all these Gestalt psychology concepts. We're all talking about looking at the whole rather than just the sum of the parts. And then you also have the concept of phenomenology. Phenomenology is just the approach on looking at nature that looks at the study of structures of experience or consciousness. It's really a study or a whole field, and it looks at consciousness or conscious experience experienced by a person in terms of like kind of a point of view way of looking at things, and also builds on this idea of intentionalism, which was the thing that we discussed a few minutes ago, and the idea of looking at things as a whole rather than in terms of its individual parts. This is all something that we kind of discussed a little bit as well before, but we can move along. The zeitgeist, again, as we discussed before, that means like the attitude of the people in general towards the end of the 19th century allowed people to look at to look at the whole experience, to look at things as a whole rather than as individual subcomponents. And people became less atomistic and looking at things from like an atomic level, which is a very very small level. One way of looking at things is looking at things on the base level, and the other thing is to look at things as a big picture. Concentrated more on fields of force. So this wasn't the thing that allowed people to discover the whole idea of the Gestalt psychology. That's separate, but it allowed it to become more accepted when you're looking at things as a whole, as a entire field of force rather than the micro aspects of somebody's conduct or somebody's thoughts. Kohler was Wolfgang Kohler. He was also a German philosopher, this one from the 20th century. And he also applied the Gestalt movement between sciences, between physics in terms of and psychology, suggesting that there are elements of both. When you're talking about physics, you look at things as a whole rather than just looking at things on the individual level and the atomic level, and Gestalt psychology really kind of borrows that concept as well. Okay, also Gestalt psychology accepted the study of consciousness but criticized the attempt to analyze it into elements. Again, the idea that consciousness meaning what's the entire feeling, what's the entire reason for behavior of a particular person, rather than looking at each individual act. Why does a person run a business in a certain way, rather than why does the person turn on the light when he walks in the morning. You could look at things as a whole, and you can look at things based on their individual parts. Again, Gestalt psychology really kind of looks at things as a whole. Behaviorism refuses to acknowledge the existence of consciousness because behaviorism, as we discussed last chapter, behaviorism is all about the idea that each individual action is based on some kind of stimulus. on the idea of operant conditioning or classical conditioning. Either way, those two whole things, the whole idea of Pavlov, is about the individual act. It's about saying, this particular act was stimulated by this particular stimulus. This particular act was done in response because the person associates the doorbell with food, or because the child associates the rabbit with the bang of the hammer on the table. All of those things really look at the stimulus for each individual action, whereas Gestalt psychology is really kind of the opposite. It looks at things, in the big picture rather than looking at everything individually. A person turned on the light because it was part of the workday rather than because it was just necessary for that particular second. Not that either one is right or wrong, but it's a different way of looking at things. It's a different way of trying to analyze things. If you have to analyze why the person turned on the light, you can look at it as part of the entire workday, or you can look at it as the individual stimulus. You can probably find things in terms of both, but there are different ways of approaching it in terms of how to, how to treat someone who has problems, or how to look at a psychological phenomenon altogether. And then we're going to move, continue with the chapter of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychologists believe that perceptions are the products of complex interactions. As we've been discussing, the general idea of Gestalt psychology being looking at the whole rather than the sum of the parts. And so this allows for the breakup of the elements from the whole situation into what it really is, because if you look at the whole situation and then you digress from there and look at the sum of the parts, it's a lot easier than if you're just looking at the sum of the parts from the beginning. Then we move to something called the phi phenomenon, which was a challenge to the Wundt system because, this is, I'll show you the phi phenomenon in a second, but the idea here is the phi phenomenon is a mechanism by which movement can be simulated by the process of an optical illusion. Let me show you what an example. Here's an example of the phi phenomenon, again, courtesy of our friends at Wikipedia. It looks like over here that there is movement. You can see hopefully you can see this, something that looks like it's moving. Nothing's actually moving. It's just a circle of purple lines, and the purple lines, now you can see there's some green one, there's a green one. Well, you can barely make it out. But the point is, because of the fact that the lights are going out one by one, it looks like there's movement around the circle, when in fact there is no movement around the circle. It just is these purple lights are going out one by one. That's the idea, and that kind of shows how the human mind looks at things as a whole. The human mind doesn't just look at the individual uh, purple lights that are going out at any given time. It looks at the diagram as a whole, and based on that, it looks like the green or the light, the invisible thing, is moving around in a circle, when in fact there's actually nothing moving in the diagram, just lights going on and off. Then we move to the experiments conducted by Wolfgang Kohler, who we discussed briefly in other contexts, of the idea, very, very much in the idea of the Gestalt psychology of restructuring a perceptual field. In other words, really what this means is giving somebody kind of an idea and allowing them to apply it to an area. He conducted a whole bunch of experiments, one of his most famous experiments being the one with a monkey, which he named Sultan. Basically, he made the monkey hungry, didn't feed the monkey for a while. He put the monkey in a cage. He put the ape in a cage, whatever it was, a chimp. I don't know what kind of primate it was. And he hung bananas from the ceiling of the cage, and he kept a box on the floor of the cage. And he put a second box, different. In other words, he put two boxes in the cage. And the only way the monkey was going to get to the banana is to take one box, put it on the other box, put them both underneath the banana, and then climb up on top of both boxes and reach up in the banana. Now, again, hopefully a human being will be able to figure that out relatively quickly. The monkeys are not necessarily designed to do that, and the monkeys couldn't figure it out. The ape couldn't figure it out. Then what he did was, while he was outside the cage, he took two boxes within the field of vision of the monkey and put one on top of the other outside the cage. And that gave the monkey the idea. Once the monkey saw that it was being done, all of a sudden the monkey was able to apply it to solve a scenario inside the cage. That's the idea of the perceptual field. The perception of the field is what we're able to perceive, what we're able to see, what we're able to hear, what we're able to taste, whatever our senses are. And so giving the monkey this idea allowed the monkey to now see the tools in the cage, namely the two boxes, in a different light than he had previously. Then we have another example, the last thing over here on the slide over here from Zygarnik. This is Bluma Zygarnik, a Russian psychologist, I imagine. And what she discovered, or what she postulated at least, is that people who suspend their study and then do other things very often are able to come back and do even better in the new in their, for example, if you're studying and you sit back and you just do nothing but study, 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 you might actually be better off in the long term taking a 2 minute break and coming back to it. The idea is, again, we're looking there, it allows you to now enter and see the big picture. You know a certain amount of the material based on your previous study activities, and now when you come back, you're going to be able to kind of look at it like more from a big picture perspective. And again, something that is also consistent with this idea of seeing the whole is more effective than seeing the individual parts, the key concept of the Gestalt psychology. And all of these things are based on organization. You think about the experiment with the monkey, you think about the idea of taking a break when you study and then coming back with kind of a clear head where you're looking at things in the big picture. It's all based on organization. It's all based on the ability to organize the elements of the big picture in order to do better at the big picture. Some of the things that include our perception and what we perceive, things like proximity, items grouped together we perceive as belonging together. We discussed this earlier. If you see a whole bunch of people walking down the street together, you might, figure out that it's not the case, but initially you would assume that they're together, doing something together. A bunch of animals together, you might assume that they're similar to each other. Similarity, if they're similar in some qualities, we perceive them as being comparable. Animals that are the same color, maybe we perceive as being belonging together. Closure, we complete incomplete pictures. If we don't see the whole picture, we make an assumption as to what missing elements there might be. Continuity, we connect items that are disconnected. Doesn't mean necessarily literally connect. We connect motives, we connect activities. The TV show runners take advantage of this constantly, where they show two scenes. I've been studying some of this on some of these famous shows. Very often, what producers will do is they'll show you two scenes consecutively that are from different parts of the world. And what they're trying to do is almost subconsciously make you make the connection. Make you make the connection between these scenes, even though they might be happening in totally different storylines, that there's some sort of an underlying theme that's running through both of them. Simplicity, tending to see certain things like squares and circles, even if they're not necessarily perfect squares or perfect circles. When we look at the picture of the Earth, we look at it as being circular, even though it's slightly oblate, slightly oval. We tend to try to make things in our mind, look at things in an elegant as manner as possible, and also seeing objects as figures separated from their backgrounds. You see a person, you see a skyline in the background, you see a building in the background. We tend to look at the individual and kind of phase out on the background, or not. I don't want to say phase out, but make sure that we're focusing on what we perceive the most important component of the picture. Social media like Facebook and Instagram, they can actually do that for you, where their computer, their algorithm is somehow able to determine what element of a picture is a person's face. We do that without any kind of algorithm. We do that by looking at a picture. We focus on the background a little bit, but we focus much more on the central components of the picture, usually the people. That leads us to the last idea in this chapter, and that's the idea of social psychology. Social psychology is a field in and of itself. It really is based on the Gestalt model of looking at things in terms of the big picture, and social psychology deals with social interactions. It deals with the effects of people, or the effects on people, based on their interactions and the origins of their interaction. Kurt Lewin, he was a German psychologist who actually was Jewish, and he left Germany before World War II. He was able to escape, but he ended up settling in the United States and doing some of his later work over there. And some of his work, which was really about social, organizational, and applied psychology, really also from the Gestalt model of psychology. And his idea was that the social context, in other words, the group, the people that you're with, becomes part of your field. which field theory is also a psychological theory that examines the pattern of interactions between the person and his or her environment. Basically, what it says is that the behavior of a person is a function of the person and his or her environment. You have to look at the nature of the person, the predispositions of a person, but you also have to look at the person's environment. And that leads to kind of the field of social action research, which is the idea of doing social problems with the aim of helping those problems uh, by doing research in terms of how certain people react in certain environments. Maybe you can change the environments. Maybe you can train people to expect certain problems to arise. That's part of the field of social psychology.
When looking at this, what's the first thing you see? Do you see a bicycle? Or do you see handlebars, pedals, spokes, tires, brakes, a seat, and a frame? If you're human, I'm guessing you saw a bike. This idea that we make sense of things by seeing a whole rather than the individual parts is called Gestalt psychology, and its principles are especially important for designers in creating complete and compelling visuals. Because of psychologists Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka, and Wolfgang Kohler, Gestalt theory can be broken down into 6 design principles. Figure ground. The thought that when we look at a scene, we separate objects so that some are the focus, or figure, and others are the background. Similarity. The notion that we place objects with similar characteristics in a group. These characteristics can include color, size, font, shape, texture, and more. Proximity. The belief that we group together objects that are close to each other. Closure. The idea that our minds close objects that are not necessarily together or complete in order to create a whole. Continuity. The theory that we continue to follow objects that are visually aligned until they are interrupted. Order. The belief that alignment and symmetry are attractive and essential elements of design. When Gestalt principles are ignored, designs tend to look out of place or incomplete, forcing our eyes to focus on little inconsistencies rather than the greater whole. You may not know exactly what seems off, but you will feel something is out of place. The best designs, unintentionally, make the world feel a little less chaotic.
Chapter 7 or Unit 7 is about a controversial and very interesting subject called psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis based on the idea you can speak to a patient, get the patient to speak his or her mind, and able to analyze what problems the patient might be experiencing. It's one thing to give the client self-confidence or to talk the client into calmness or to prescribe drugs, and psychoanalysis is an entirely other field whose utility and effectiveness is very much in doubt in today's day and age. It was really Sigmund Freud's main calling card, so to speak, and to some extent, some people will tell you that it's been a little discredited to this point. The idea of psychoanalysis, purveyed by Freud, and as we'll see a little bit later on, by Joseph Breuer, an Austrian, I believe, Austrian psychologist, it was based on the idea that mental illness is not necessarily something that can be treated or something that can be fixed, rather than something that either has to be treated by drugs or something that is completely unfixable, like certain types of medical conditions. There was also the evolutionary work of Darwin that helped the psychoanalysis field. And the reason for that was the connection between psychoanalysis and evolution, based on the idea essentially that psychoanalysis or the mechanisms by which our mind operates are really based on evolution, based on things that we really need in order to help ourselves thrive. This is from the American Psychological Association website. It discusses a little bit of the connection between psychoanalysis And for I just wanted to show you some of the points over here that they really some of the connections between psychoanalysis and evolution are the evolutionary processes have sculpted not merely the body but also the brain. And so our mechanical processes that go through our brain are based on what we need, and those things, I guess, then by definition can be adjusted or can be changed. Many of those mechanisms are best conceptualized as psychological adaptations, which means the adaptations that we're making with our mind designed to solve problems. And so, therefore, psychological adaptations, along with the byproducts, are activated in modern environments. So we can, I guess, activate different mechanisms of our brain depending on what we need. So we can kind of fix our psychological problems in that way. And also the notion that psychological mechanisms have adaptive functions is a necessary, not optimal ingredient. So that the psychological mechanisms are based on adaptations to the extent that they can kind of be turned on and turned off as needed. We have a book by Frank Sulloway who makes the argument that Darwin was much more influential on Freud, again, making this idea between the uh, evolution and I wouldn't say evolution per se, but certainly things like survival of the fittest, things like natural selection, and psychoanalysis. Sulloway, interestingly enough, was most famous for a book that he wrote establishing how our environment and things like even which number sibling we are, whether we're born first or born second, has a large effect on our personality. And he established that, and I guess there's probably a connection between that and the idea that the whole Gestalt psychology idea that everything is a massive product of it's a product of of our overall environment. Psychoanalysis today has declined. One reason is because people don't believe in it as much as they used to. Another reason is because it takes a long time. Psychologists will tell you you have to go maybe 10 sessions or 20 sessions in order to get in a real psychoanalysis, and sessions as psychologists are very, very expensive. And another possibility is that drugs and other therapies are quicker and they're faster and faster is quicker, but they're cheaper and they're less invasive. Rather than sitting on a couch and going through psychoanalysis for 20 sessions, you can go to the drugstore and take a drug and it works overnight rather than working over the course of 20 weeks. Psychoanalysis has had a significant impact on our popular culture. As recently as 2005, the BBC produced a 4-hour television documentary about Freud's influence, and here Freud remains the most frequently cited person in the psychology research literature, according to the American Psychological Association, and its division is the sixth largest. The psychoanalysis division is sixth largest of the American Psychological Association's divisions, again illustrating the popularity of the whole psychoanalysis concept, even if it is not as prevalent as it once was. Aside from its time and expense, some of the problems with psychoanalysis included some of these. First of all, Freud was unsystematic. He worked from notes written after the therapy sessions, which may not have been as effective as if they had been written during the therapy sessions, not exactly in keeping with scientific principles to make every observation be as close to the actual facts as possible. Another possibility that Freud's been criticized is that Freud may have guided patients with suggestions rather than simply left it as a blank canvas to allow the patients and their symptoms to be analyzed completely. Freud's sample was small and of limited generalizability, which is based on the idea in general of research methods. If you've taken that course, you want as big a sample size as possible. You want as broad a range as possible before you draw any conclusions. There are discrepancies between Freud's notes on therapy sessions and the published case histories that are based on those notes. That's obviously, if established, could be a severe problem with any study, and that Freud didn't attempt to verify if his patients were telling the truth. Sometimes people could have been pulling the wool over the psychologist's eyes, especially if they're not completely mentally normal, and those are usually sometimes the people that go to people like Sigmund Freud for therapy. And he didn't really verify their claims, and so that of course leaves the interpretation of what they say very much open to debate. The American public was primed by Freud's work by a man by the name of Bruce Fink, who wrote a whole bunch of articles for consumption in the United States about Freud and about psychoanalysis and about the unconscious. I did mention briefly a couple of minutes ago about Joseph Breuer, who was an Austrian psychologist, I believe, and he treated a woman named Anna O, and this was an interesting case. It was of psychoanalysis, and some people will tell you the success. She was treated for a whole bunch of different symptoms. She suffered language disorders, paralysis, visual impairments, mood swings, amnesia, eating disorders, all sorts of problems she had. She was diagnosed with hysteria. Her treatment, she was treated for psychoanalysis, and it was eventually discovered that she was suffering because she was repressing terrible memories from her past about her father's illnesses and her father's supposed illnesses and all that. But the point is that she was treated, and the perception was that it was successful, and that's what kind of got the psychoanalysis's foot in the door, so to speak. I've been reading that actually some people say that she wasn't really helped, that she was worse off when she ended when she ended therapy than when she started. But the point is, eventually she was quote unquote cured, or at least helped, and that kind of the case illustrated, at least to many people, the power of psychoanalysis. According to this article that I'm reading now, the West German government eventually issued a postage stamp in honor of her contributions to the field of to this field. So that was one case that led to a lot of positive publicity for psychoanalysis. Then we move on to Karen Horney, who was also a German psychoanalyst who also eventually moved to the United States. She passed away in the middle 20th century, and she looked at psychoanalysis and came up with a lot of other concepts also that we deal with in today's day and age. Basic anxiety is the result of environmental and societal forces in a person's childhood. Anxiety, there are three uh, things that are kind of confused with each other. There's anxiety, there is fear, and there's depression. Fear is not only rational, it's necessary. You have to have fear in order to survive. Otherwise, you would, stick your hand in fires and jump off buildings, and you wouldn't be afraid. Then even you jump in front of trains, and eventually you just kill yourself because you don't have any fear of it. Anxiety means a constant state of heightened awareness and heightened worry, whereas there's depression, which is kind of the opposite, almost like a sedative effect, where a person has a decrease or a lack of positive feelings. So anxiety is a result of societal factors where that person essentially grows up on. The idea that the person is always trained to be worried about something. Watch out for that person. He's going to kidnap you, and watch out for that lightning bolt is going to hit you, and watch out for this, and watch out for that. And eventually the person starts being trained to get worried about everything. And now it's obviously not quite that simple. Some people that are helicopter parented, so to speak, never develop anxiety, and some people that are not do. So it is much more complicated than that, but that certainly is one element. And looking at the societal factors or societal forces that influence somebody is a mechanism by which society can be predicted or related to. And the person takes on behaviors that are driven by neurotic need. Neurotic. The word neurotic, also when it's constant, it's a constant pattern of neurotic behavior is sometimes called a neurosis. Neurosis is a disease, or really a psychological disease, that involves symptoms of depression, anxiety, obsessive behavior, something like that, but not as strong as more severe mental illnesses like psychosis is. It's not quite a psychosis, it's just it's something that is caused by constant state of, it could be stress, could be pretty much anything. Excessive anxiety, excessive depression, obsession, something like that could develop into a neurosis. And there are many different types of neuroses, many different manifestations of neurotic behavior. An aggressive personality with a neurosis might turn that into a need for power or exploitation. A compliant personality, somebody who craves other people's opinion that suffers from neurosis, might parlay that into a need for approval or affection. Again, none of these things are bad inherently. Nothing wrong with wanting to be loved, and nothing wrong with wanting to have power and wanting to affect other people. But if it's done excessively, or if it's there in excessive quantities, it could obviously cause major problems. The detached personality, somebody who doesn't is not worried about as worried about things, is kind of like the opposite of somebody who is who's anxious, could develop that into a need for independence or a need for perfection, becoming a perfectionist or a distrust of people is a possible neurosis that could establish from somebody who is who has a detached personality. And that could turn into an idealized self-image, which is a false picture. Idealized means that's your ideal, that's what you're thinking of, and your idealized self-image is you think that you're somebody that you're not. You think that you have all this power. Or you think that that you're despised and hated when in fact you're not really. That is that's a problem that neurosis could cause to give somebody this false picture, this false idealized self-image. Next, we get to the collective unconscious, which is an idea developed by Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychoanalyst as well, born back in 1875. And he actually, believe it or not, not only was he a psychologist, he was also an anthropologist. He also did work in many other areas. And that kind of informs his work because his main work related to the quote unquote collective unconscious, which is the inherited experiences of all humans. Not obviously, not every single person has the experiences of every single other person, but his experience in things like archaeology and anthropology, literature, philosophy, even religious studies informs his basic idea that people have a common thread in terms of the human experience and how human beings have developed. And the collective unconscious was that these inherited tendencies throughout that are really common throughout all people and all cultures can be broken down into a few archetypes, and these few archetypes can be the human experiences, and they break down to a few common threads. And you see this in culture throughout the world. You see these like kind of tropes in movies and in books and in various other things. And these are kind of like threads or common themes. Personas is one example. Persona is when people present masks to kind of hide their true identity or to hide what their personality really is. You see that a lot in books and in literature and in movies. You see where people are trying to put up a facade, put up a front. Anima or animus, the characteristic of the opposite gender, men exhibiting feminine traits, women exhibiting masculine traits. Then there's the shadow, the dark animalistic part, the emotional part, the requirement or the desire for to fulfill animalistic desires. And then finally you have the self, which is the most important archetype, the balance we strike within our unconscious. The idea these things obviously exist. That's not a big brand new concept, but the idea that these are some of the things that you can see throughout the thread of all cultures on Earth. You take movies, you take books, you take different things, games, and you throughout the world and throughout history, they can all kind of be broken down into some of the or some combination of the archetypes you see over here. Finally, we finish up with a couple of more aspects of psychoanalysis. objective anxiety and objective relations. Objective anxiety, again, an idea that was fathered by Sigmund Freud, as many of the things that we've discussed have been, that the feeling of impending danger can be based on objective, neurotic, or moral threats. The idea that there are real threats out there, and that would be an objective threat. Neurotic threat is when somebody suffers from a neurosis because of heightened anxiety or some other similar thing, and or moral threats where there is some sort of an actual environmental stimulus that causes people to fear something. That is what causes anxiety. Anxiety could just be something as simple as the fear of an impending danger. Obviously, it's more than just a regular fear of something immediate, because anxiety is characterized by something that is consistent. That's not a one-time thing. If you see a train coming and you're afraid of it, that's not anxiety. That's fear, and that's a good thing, obviously. So objective anxiety results from a real threat to one's well-being when there is an actual threat out there. There's also other types of anxiety, according to Freud. There's neurotic anxiety when the person's ego is overwhelmed, as we discussed before in terms of neurosis. There's also moral anxiety, which is based on that a person feels that his or her values are compromised. Guilt would be an example of moral anxiety. If you've ever read not William Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe's book, The Telltale Heart, it's kind of the guilt eats up a person so much that the murderer so much that he actually feels that he hears the heart of his murder victim beating under the floorboards. That would be an example of moral anxiety, where a person's guilt is eating him alive. Then we have object relations theory, which is the process of developing a psyche, in other words, a personality, a psychological profile in relation to others. According to this, you could say that the most critical developmental issue for a child is to break free of his or her dominant personality, namely, for most people, that's the mother, to establish a sense of self. That's really kind of what being an adolescent is all about. Developing one's own independence and doing it in a way, I think we discussed earlier, the bridge between childhood and adulthood is that stress and strain period where it's necessary to break away from the mother figure and establish a personality of his or her own. And finally, for the chapter, we have Alfred Adler and his theory of psychology. Alfred Adler was also a late 19th century and early 20th century Austrian psychologist. And he developed individual psychology, including the birth order. This is a concept that we saw before when it came to Frank Soloway. He discussed that as well. That is an important development of personality. Maybe the firstborn is a little bit more self-confident and in control and a little more comfortable being the leader and being the boss. People who have many older siblings are a little bit more likely to take their cues from people. Obviously, there are always going to be exceptions, but this could be a tendency. People strive for superiority, and therefore people who do not have that superiority develop an inferiority complex, which is a key role in personality development. And then we have the social interest, which is the human potential to cooperate with other people. All people have a social interest. Some people are more introverted, some people are more extroverted, but everybody has this ability to cooperate with other people and to do, the whole is sometimes greater than the sum of the parts, where a person can use skills and mechanisms of working with other people, working with partners to do things that he or she would not be able to do so on her own.
My name is Sigmund Freud.
Sigmund Freud, a physiologist, a medical doctor, a psychologist, and the founder of psychoanalysis. He is generally recognized as being one of the most influential and authoritative thinkers of the 20th century. His famous collaboration with Joseph Breuer in 1892 had marked the beginnings of psychoanalysis. They had elaborated on the theory that the mind is a complex energy system. He expressed to refine the concepts of the unconscious, of infantile sexuality, of repression, and proposed an account of the mind structure, all part of the understanding of the human psychological development and the treating of mental conditions. As he pursued his medical researches, he had concluded that the most fascinating mysteries lay hidden in the complex operations of the human mind. One of the things that Freud and Brewer discovered was that the symptoms of hysterical patients had derived from trauma in early life. The patient was usually not even consciously aware of these drives and experiences. He concluded that the unconscious mind plays a major role in shaping the behavior of an individual. He also concluded that to block painful trauma of early life, people develop things that he called defense mechanisms. If the patient used too much of their energy to produce them, they could develop diseases, one of which he called neurosis. Brewer and Freud had created a paper called On the Psychical Mechanism of Hysterical Phenomena, which demonstrated the use of hypnosis for treatment of hysteria. The cathartic method was the name of the treatment, and it consisted of the patient recalling and reproducing the forgotten memories while under hypnosis. The medical profession looked down upon the paper. Moreover, Brewer and Freud separated because of Freud's growing conviction that the undefined energy causing conversion was sexual in nature. After they separated, Freud rejected the idea of hypnosis, devised his theory of the unconscious mind, and began using the term psychoanalysis in 1896. Freud's theory of the unconscious mind is exceedingly deterministic, in other words, relating to the belief that everything, including every human act, is caused by something, and that there is no real free will. Freud was possibly the first thinker to apply deterministic principles to the mind and say that the human behaviors is only explainable by usually hidden processes or states that determine it. His theory suggests that freedom of free will is nothing more than illusion, and that the hidden mental processes, but which we are unaware of the fact that we have absolutely no control, ultimately govern us. Freud considered the mind structurally similar to an iceberg, most of it lying below the surface, exerting a dynamic and determining influence upon the conscious mind. Freud also came to see personality as having three separate aspects: id, ego, and the superego. All three needed to be well balanced to have a good mental health. The id contains basic needs and feelings, and is essentially the pleasure principle. The ego realizes that you cannot always get what you want, and is basically the reality principle. Moreover, the superego is the moral part of the mind, and usually strives for perfection, though the so-called perfection is typically far from reality. He also grouped the instincts into two broad categories: eros, the life instinct, which covered all of the self-preserving instincts, and then thanatos, the death instinct, for all hostility and cruelty. Freud put major stress on the concept of sexual drives, and called them the centrality of human life, actions, and behavior, even arguing that these drives could be found in children at birth. Nevertheless, Freud has successfully redefined the term sexuality here to make it cover any form of pleasure which is or can be derived from the body, thus making the theory of infantile sexuality state that the human being is motivated from birth by the craving to obtain bodily pleasure. Yet at best, Freud considered civilized living as a compromise between wishes and repression. Freud's aim was not only to create a sweeping theory of mental functioning and malfunctioning, but also to devise the rules of psychoanalytic treatment. However, the usefulness of analysis is still a matter of controversy.
Sigmund Freud is one of the most revered and controversial people of the 20th century. His work transcended the boundaries of science, bringing psychology into the mainstream. Terms such as superego, Oedipal complex, sibling rivalry, and Freudian slips all have become part of our culture just as much as they are part of psychoanalysis.
The Freudian theory had an immense impact. Although his theories were considered shocking when they were created, and they still continue to create much controversy, but no one argues against his great influence. His theories have influenced many fields as varied as anthropology, education, art, and literary criticism, his largest impact being in psychiatry and psychology. He was one of the world's most influential thinkers and showed the crucial importance of unconscious thinking to all human thought and activity. His theories on sexual development had led to debates on how to treat sexual matters and issues. The stress he had put on the importance of childhood helped teach the value of giving children an emotionally nourishing environment. Freud's theories even influenced surrealism in art and literature. Similar to psychoanalysis, surrealistic painting and writing explores the inner depths of unconscious mind, giving artists and writers subject matter. Since the 1970s, Freud's theories were questioned and attacked, for example, by feminists. In some respects, he seemed to believe that women were inferior to men, had weaker superegos, and were driven by envy. Although we have now moved far beyond Freud in learning about the human brain and behavior, neurological studies reveal the fact that there is such thing as the unconscious mind, where forgotten memories are stored away in the brain. Freud laid the foundations for today's awareness of the destructive effects of child abuse, both sexual and violent, and of child neglect, and changed the way we thought about children, trauma, human development, and personality in general. Whether we choose to agree with Freud or not, we indefinitely owe him a debt of gratitude for setting us on the course of learning.
Unit 8 kind of ties everything in the course together. And it starts with the idea that psychology is more fragmented than ever. You have the American Psychological Association and the American Psychological Society, the APA and the APS. They're very different. They support different types of research. We're kind of going to go through all the various fields that we've discussed and look at, what their stand is in the modern trends of psychological research. Evolutionary psychology will probably not be the last school of psychology, as we discussed. That's certainly an element of what you're seeing today. And we get into this idea of cognitive neuroscience. Now, cognitive means the ability to act and the ability to engage in motion. Neuroscience means the science of the neurons, the science of your nervous system, the science of how the brain reacts with the body. That is a little bit of the fusion of psychology and physiology, or psychology and neurology, where you're looking at psychology in a way that is affected by the actual brain cells. It's one thing to try to engage in psychoanalysis or to determine whether somebody's depressed or determine whether somebody has various other ailments, neuroses, psychoses. But if you are able to break it down to the cellular level, if you're able to break it down to the nervous system and say, okay, this person has this trauma or this person has this psychosis because these neurological impulses are running, that's a way to deal with psychology from a little bit of a different angle. More of a pharmaceutical angle, more of an angle when you're talking about drugs or various other types of physical remedies rather than just psychoanalysis and psychological remedies. So certainly something like cognitive neuroscience you'll see that happen more and more as technology improves. Now, of course, we've got the different schools of thought of psychology, and we have looked at all of these throughout this course, and we'll just kind of go over them a little bit. Each of these schools of thoughts developed, prospered, and then became part of the mainstream contemporary psychological thought. Notice we have, with the exception of psychoanalysis, which has kind of decreased in its influence in the modern psychological thought, but these are all kind of build on each other, the rest of them. Structuralism, which you may recall was a method of interpretation of human behavior that focused on relationships of contrast between different components of systems, a doctrine of looking at the structure of a society, the structure of thought, then that had maybe not as much direct impact on modern psychology, but it prompted psychology as a discipline separate from philosophy. In other words, it was an old system that kind of separated psychology from people used to look at it as a matter of philosophy, which is much, much less of a physical issue than it's thought of as today. Then you have functionalism. Remember the idea of functionalism, of looking at psychology from its practical impact in the real world. And then you have Gestalt psychology, which we spent a lot of time on, which looking at things in the big picture, opposing elementalism, which was looking at everything on an elemental or individual level, making conscious processes a legitimate topic for psychology because the conscious process is basically looking at everything while determining what to do. Behaviorism and psychoanalysis, the behavioral psychology was another an important element of psychology, and cognitive psychology, which is a forerunner of cognitive neuroscience, was based on the idea of psychology based on movement, psychology based on physical feelings, psychology based on uh, the physics of the human body or the physical aspects of the human body, the physiology. And psychoanalysis again was little different from that, but that's also a component of the modern school of psychology. Although, as we discussed before, that's under more questioning than some of these other schools. And then you have cognitive psychology, cognitive essentially the idea of how the physical manifestation of the brain and neurology has an impact on human behavior. Cognitive psychologists study how the mind structures or organizes experience, experience meaning how we act, how we process things, how we fear, how we love, how we engage in interactions with our environment, and these focus on the process of knowing rather than merely responding to stimuli. If you think about it, it's almost, again, an outgrowth of Gestalt psychology, this idea that we're looking at the entire process of doing something or feeling something or reacting to something rather than just pulling our hands out of the fire because we have a reflex and that it hurts. Cognitive psychologists believe that we actively and creatively engage with our environment. We don't just react individually to individual stimuli. We look at the big picture again. I know I've said that a million times, but that's really what this is about. We make choices about which stimuli to attend to. We have many different things that may require our attention, and we use our thought processes to decide which one is the most compelling in this particular aspect. There also remains considerable confusion about terminology and definitions. Okay, again, nothing major there. Then, of course, you have behavioral psychology, some of which looks at the fact that or assumes that behaviors are um, reflexes or responses to stimuli. It's a little different than cognitive psychology, certainly different than Gestalt psychology. It's based on the idea here that behaviorism is based on reflexes. Many of the experiments that we've discussed throughout this course are focused on those kinds of ideas. Okay, so now let's look at the two, I guess, main sections or main components of psychology in today's schools of thoughts of psychology. First, you have cognitive psychology, again, based on neuroscience, based on really cognition means thinking and the ability to control things. Embedded cognition is an idea that recognizes there are physical aspects of cognition revealed in brain activity. In other words, if you can measure things like depression or anxiety or various emotions, if you can measure that with brain activities, that could be a massive step because you could really test people's reactions to different things, and you can tell what kinds of things people actually react to, and therefore what can help with depression, what could help with anxiety. So perceptual and motor response systems, even motor response means motions, moving around, how fast people move, slow, whatever it is, can affect, direct, and determine the cognitive processes that occur in the mind. The connection between cognition, thought, and motion and behavior is a very important component of cognitive neuroscience and therefore cognitive psychology. Cognitive overload is the idea of doing more than one thing at a time. This cognitive psychology concept is known as multitasking, where a person is trying to do too many things at the same time, and that, of course, causes any one of them to suffer. And so that's why college students who are exposed to a variety of electronic imaging tasks at the same time, trying to focus on too many different things at the same time, ended up performing poorly because of this idea of overload. In other courses, we talked about things like role overload, where somebody tries to do too many things, and that causes at least some of the aspects to suffer. And then we've got evolutionary psychology, and this we've also discussed as we moved along, the idea that various feelings are developed to help people to carry out life processes. It's a relatively new psychological approach, and they try to identify which psychological traits have evolved adaptations to help with things. Do things like love and anger and jealousy, are these things that that help people survive? Are these things that are necessary or are helpful? And that's kind of like what the science looks to. Some of the questions that are dealt with: what are the parts and processes of the mind? How are they designed and organized? That again, helps people to helps psychologists, helps people that study this, help to figure out which processes are necessary, which processes are important. What are the functions of the mind? What does the mind do? What does the mind take care of? What aspects of the life processes are the mind in charge of? What explains the nature of the mind? That's one thing we don't really know that much about. What is the nature of the human mind, and why does it operate the way it did? And in what ways do stimuli from the environment react with predispositions? Somebody could be predisposed to be anxious. That could be genealogical. That could be the sort of thing that people inherit from their parents. That could be the sort of thing that is, kind of baked into their DNA. So how does predisposition interact with nature? How does basically nature interact with nurture? Where we're looking at how people might have predispositions to do something, but they might not act on it. They say some people are more predisposed to be alcoholics, whereas some people don't really have that thing in their nature. It doesn't mean that the person that's predisposed is actually going to be an alcoholic. It just means that the person may have to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more wary to make sure that they don't fall into the trap that their nature may perhaps predisposes them to. Finally, the last two things are really two more people and their impact that I want to discuss. The first is the Turing test, named for Alan Turing. He was, I believe, a code breaker during World War II. Recently saw a movie about him. But anyway, the Turing test is the test of a machine's capability to exhibit intelligent behavior that is indistinguishable from that of a human. We all know that a machine can't actually be a human. The difference is that a machine has to act basically the way it's programmed, whereas a human can adapt. If you look at it, the Turing test is something that's very often applied to computer programs, games, robots, things that you want to see, okay, how much is this person behaving in a way that simulates human behavior? It's a test to determine how effective artificial intelligence may be at reproducing certain things that human beings need or want. The issue between the Turing test is to determine if an interrogator can distinguish between a computer from a human by asking questions and seeing what the answers are. The more easily a person's able to make a determination that this is a computer and not a human answering, the lower the score on the Turing test. You hear sometimes people will say a computer program has kind of a Turing feel about it. What they mean is that it seems a little bit more natural. It seems like a little bit more, human influenced.
What is consciousness? Can an artificial machine really think? Does the mind just consist of neurons in the brain, or is there some intangible spark at its core? For many, these have been vital considerations for the future of artificial intelligence. But British computer scientist Alan Turing decided to disregard all these questions in favor of a much simpler one. Can a computer talk like a human? This question led to an idea for measuring artificial intelligence that would famously come to be known as the Turing test. In the 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Turing proposed the following game. A human judge has a text conversation with unseen players and evaluates their responses. To pass the test, a computer must be able to replace one of the players without substantially changing the results. In other words, a computer would be considered intelligent if its conversation couldn't be easily distinguished from a human's. Turing predicted that by the year 2000, machines with 100 megabytes of memory would be able to easily pass his test. But he may have jumped the gun. Even though today's computers have far more memory than that, few have succeeded. And those that have done well focused more on finding clever ways to fool judges than using overwhelming computing power. Though it was never subjected to a real test, the first program with some claim to success was called ELIZA. With only a fairly short and simple script, it managed to mislead many people by mimicking a psychologist, encouraging them to talk more and reflecting their own questions back at them. Another early script, Perry, took the opposite approach by imitating a paranoid schizophrenic who kept steering the conversation back to his own pre-programmed obsessions. Their success in fooling people highlighted one weakness of the test. Humans regularly attribute intelligence to a whole range of things that are not actually intelligent. Nonetheless, annual competitions like the Loebner Prize have made the test more formal, with judges knowing ahead of time that some of their conversation partners are machines. But while the quality has improved, many chatbot programmers have used similar strategies to Eliza and Perry. 1997's winner, Catherine, could carry on amazingly focused and intelligent conversation, but mostly if the judge wanted to talk about Bill Clinton. And the more recent winner, Eugene Gustman, was given the persona of a 13-year-old Ukrainian boy, so judges interpreted its non sequiturs and awkward grammar as language and culture barriers. Meanwhile, other programs like Cleverbot have taken a different approach by statistically analyzing huge databases of real conversations to determine the best responses. Some also store memories of previous conversations in order to improve over time. But while Cleverbot's individual responses can sound incredibly human, its lack of a consistent personality and inability to deal with brand new topics are a dead giveaway. Who in Turing's day could have predicted that today's computers would be able to pilot spacecraft, perform delicate surgeries, and solve massive equations, but still struggle with the most basic small talk? Human language turns out to be an amazingly complex phenomenon that can't be captured by even the largest dictionary. Chatbots can be baffled by simple pauses like, or questions with no correct answer. And a simple conversational sentence like, I took the juice out of the fridge and gave it to him, but forgot to check the date, requires a wealth of underlying knowledge and intuition to parse. It turns out that simulating a human conversation takes more than just increasing memory and processing power. And as we get closer to Turing's goal, we may have to deal with all those big questions about consciousness after all.
Okay, and then finally we have Ulrich Neisser. He's actually he was born in Germany. Later, he did most of his work in the United States, and he has been referred to the father of cognitive psychology. He said that one of the things he said was that memory was reconstructed, not necessarily based on like a picture. It's more something that you look at from a total big picture perspective. Human memory is influenced by the other things that the person has thought, and these ideas kind of tied into this connection between cognition and human behavior. He also insisted that psychological research should have ecological validity, which means that they should be reproducible in real life. If something is thought up in a lab and can be reproduced in experiments in a lab but can't be applied to real life, then they're useless. To be useful, you should be able to go out and test these theories on humans and see how if they react the way you'd predict they were based on these theories. Otherwise, the theories are kind of useless. He also insisted that cognitive psychologists should be able to apply their findings to practical problems to help people deal with everyday issues. And eventually, he perhaps came to the conclusion that maybe cognitive psychology didn't contribute that much to understanding how people cope, because he felt that without the application to how humans actually behave, the whole thing becomes kind of useless and irrelevant. Okay, so those are the issues that we wanted to cover, and that's pretty much just the really basic outlines of this course. Hope you enjoyed the crash course, and we wish you good luck on the exam, and please contact us if you have any questions.